In the year 980, a child was born in Persia who would fundamentally reshape human thought. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, did something extraordinary. He took the entire edifice of Greek philosophy, the theology of Islam, and his own piercing observations about reality, and forged them into a system so powerful that it dominated intellectual life for 6 centuries. But here is what makes Ibn Sina truly remarkable. He was not simply brilliant. He asked questions that still haunt philosophy today. What does it mean for something to exist? Is your essence what you are the same as your existence that you are? Can we know anything with absolute certainty? What is the relationship between God and everything else that exists? Most philosophers before him tried to answer these questions. Ibn Sina did something different. He showed that the very way we were asking these questions was wrong. He revealed hidden assumptions we did not know we were making. He demonstrated that existence itself was stranger, more profound, and more mysterious than anyone had imagined. Part 1. The Scandal of Existence: Why Things Are more mysterious than what things are. Let me start with the insight that makes Ibn Sina genuinely revolutionary, and it begins with a question so simple it sounds stupid. Why does anything exist at all? Every philosopher before Ibn Sina, from Plato to Aristotle to the early Islamic theologians, focused obsessively on what things are. What is the essence of a horse? What makes a tree a tree? What is the definition of justice? They assumed that if you could define something's essence perfectly, you understood it completely. Ibn Sina said, "You have all missed the most important question. The question is not what something is, but that it is." Here is what he meant, and this requires careful attention. Take any object in front of you, a cup, a book, your own hand. Now ask yourself 2 different questions. First, what is it? You can answer, it is a cup, it is a ceramic vessel designed to hold liquid. That is its essence, its definition, its whatness. But now ask the second question, why does this cup exist rather than not exist? Why is there something here rather than nothing? And here is where it gets strange. The definition of a cup, its essence, tells you nothing about whether any cup actually exists. You could know everything about what a cup is, have a perfect understanding of cupness, and yet the universe might contain 0 cups. The essence does not necessitate the existence. Ibn Sina called this the distinction between essence and existence, and it split philosophy in half. For most things in the universe, essence and existence are separate. A horse's essence, its horseness, does not include existence. Horses could have not existed. The universe would have been perfectly coherent without them. Their existence is added to their essence from outside, like a property grafted onto them. Think about what this means. It means that for almost everything you encounter, its existence is borrowed, contingent, dependent. Nothing about the thing itself explains why it exists. A tree does not contain within its treeness the reason for its being here. Neither do you. Your essence, what makes you human, could have been instantiated or not. The universe did not have to produce you. Now here is where Ibn Sina's argument becomes explosive. If everything in the universe has this character, if every single thing we encounter has existence merely tacked onto its essence, then we face a problem. Where does existence come from? What is doing the tacking? You cannot say existence comes from other contingent things that just pushes the question back. If A exists because B gave it existence, and B exists because C gave it existence, you have explained nothing. You have just created an infinite regress. It is like explaining why a train is moving by saying the first car is pulled by the second car and the second by the third forever. Nothing is actually doing the pulling. So Ibn Sina argues there must be something in reality that is different. There must be at least one thing whose essence and existence are identical, fused, the same thing. This being does not receive existence from outside, it is existence itself. It cannot not exist, because non-existence would contradict its very nature. He called this the necessary being, wajib al-wujud in Arabic. Everything else is a contingent being, mumkin al-wujud, something that might exist or might not. Now, before you dismiss this as just another proof for God, pause and consider how radical this is. Ibn Sina is not saying we need God to create things like a cosmic craftsman making furniture. He is saying something far stranger, that existence itself is a mystery that requires explanation, and that explanation must bottom out in something whose very essence is to exist. Let me make this concrete with an example that Ibn Sina himself would not have known, but which illuminates his point perfectly. Think about the laws of physics, the fundamental constants of nature. Why does the speed of light have the value it has? Why is the gravitational constant what it is? These values could have been different. Nothing in the essence of a universe requires these particular numbers. Their specificity is contingent. They require explanation beyond themselves. Modern physicists have struggled with exactly this question, proposing multiverse theories and anthropic principles to explain why our universe has the parameters it does. Ibn Sina would say, of course you are struggling because you are encountering the scandal of existence itself, the mystery that contingent facts require grounding in something necessary. But here is where the debates begin, and they are fierce. Al-Ghazali, writing about 70 years after Ibn Sina's death, launched a devastating attack. He said, "You have made a category error, Ibn Sina. Existence is not a property that gets added to essence like colour gets added to a wall. To say something exists is not to say it has an additional feature. It is to say that the thing is there at all, that it is instantiated in reality. This is not just philosophical nitpicking, it strikes at the heart of Ibn Sina's system. If existence is not a property, then the whole distinction between essence and existence collapses. You cannot say that God's essence includes existence as a property, because existence is not the kind of thing that can be a property. It would be like saying the essence of a triangle includes being thought about. It makes no sense. Modern philosophers like Kant would later make a similar critique, arguing that existence is not a real predicate. When you say unicorns do not exist, you are not saying there are unicorns that lack the property of existence. You are saying there are no unicorns at all. But Ibn Sina has defenders, and their response is subtle. They argue that Al-Ghazali and Kant have misunderstood the claim. Ibn Sina is not saying existence is a property like blue or heavy. He is saying that for most things there is a real distinction between what a thing is conceived to be and whether it actually is. The fact that you can coherently conceive of something without knowing if it exists proves that essence and existence are separable in thought and separable in reality for contingent beings. The contemporary philosopher Peter van Inwagen puts it this way: if you're trying to make a complete list of everything that exists, you need two kinds of information. First, descriptions of what kinds of things there are, essences. Second, which of those descriptions are instantiated, which ones have existence added to them. This two-step process reveals that essence and existence are genuinely distinct. Here is where Ibn Sina's insight becomes practically important, not just theoretically interesting. If most things in reality are contingent, if their existence is borrowed and dependent, then everything we encounter is fragile in a profound sense. Not just fragile in the sense that it might break or die, but fragile in the sense that it might simply cease to exist, because whatever is sustaining its existence stops doing so. This has immediate implications for ethics and meaning. If you are a contingent being, then your existence is a gift, not a right. It is sustained moment by something beyond yourself. This is not meant to be depressing. Ibn Sina saw it as the source of humility and wonder. Everything that exists is, in a sense, miraculous, because it overcomes the default state of nothingness. But it also raises a devastating question that Ibn Sina spent his life trying to answer. If everything flows from the necessary being, if all existence is borrowed from this single source, then what about evil? What about suffering? What about the sheer arbitrariness and cruelty we observe in the world? The necessary being, if it exists, cannot be indifferent or malevolent because it is the source of all existence, and existence itself is good. It is better to be than not to be. But then why is the world the way it is? Why do children suffer? Why does nature kill with earthquakes and disease? If the necessary being's essence is to exist and to give existence, why does it give existence to things that cause such pain? Ibn Sina's answer to this will shock you, and it will be the subject of our next part. But for now, sit with the strangeness of his core insight, that existence itself is not something to take for granted, that it is the deepest mystery we face, and that most philosophy has been asking the wrong questions by focusing on essence rather than existence. The scandal is not what things are, it is that they are at all. Part 2. Emanation and the Problem of Evil. Why God cannot help making a flawed universe. Now we arrive at perhaps the most controversial and philosophically dangerous idea Ibn Sina ever proposed. If there is a necessary being that is pure existence, pure perfection, pure unity, how does it produce everything else? How do we get from the one to the messy, multiple, flawed universe we live in? Ibn Sina's answer is called emanation, and it is nothing like creation as most people understand it. God does not decide to create, does not choose what to make, does not plan and execute like a craftsman. Instead, the universe flows from God the way light flows from the sun, necessarily, eternally, without choice or deliberation. Here is the argument, and pay close attention because this is where Ibn Sina parts ways with mainstream Islamic theology completely. The necessary being must think, must have intellection. What does it think about? It cannot think about anything outside itself because that would make it dependent on something else which contradicts its necessity. So it thinks about itself, it contemplates its own perfection. But here is the strange part. When the necessary being thinks about itself, something happens. This act of self-contemplation produces an effect. It generates the first created intellect. Not because God decides to create it, but because thinking about perfection necessarily produces something, like a mirror produces a reflection. The necessary being cannot not produce the first intellect. It flows necessarily from the divine nature. Now, this first intellect does three things. First, it contemplates the necessary being, which produces a second intellect below it. Second, it contemplates itself as necessary through another, which produces the soul of the first celestial sphere. Third, it contemplates itself as possible in itself, which produces the body of the first celestial sphere. And then this process repeats. The second intellect contemplates and produces the third intellect, the soul and body of the second sphere, and so on. Like a cascade of waterfalls, each level of reality flows necessarily from the level above it, until finally, at the bottom of this great chain, you get the material world we inhabit. 10 intellects in total, according to Ibn Sina's cosmology, each one slightly less perfect than the one above it, until we reach the active intellect, the one that governs our sublunary realm. Now, before you dismiss this as mystical nonsense, understand what Ibn Sina is trying to solve. He is trying to explain how you get multiplicity, variety, difference from absolute unity. If God is absolutely one, simple, without parts or complexity, how does the diverse universe emerge? His answer is that each level of emanation introduces a tiny bit more complexity, more multiplicity, until you get the rich diversity we observe. But here is where the problems start mounting, and they are devastating. First, this system makes creation necessary, not contingent. If the universe flows from God's nature the way heat flows from fire, then God could not have not created the universe. The universe is as eternal and necessary as God himself. This directly contradicts the Quranic teaching that God chose to create, that creation is an act of divine will. Al-Ghazali seized on this and declared Ibn Sina a heretic, an unbeliever, for denying that God freely created the world. The charge was not exaggerated. This is a fundamental difference. If creation is necessary, then God is not truly free. God becomes like a machine that must operate according to its programming, even if that programming is perfect. Ibn Sina tried to defend himself by saying that God's knowledge of his own perfection is itself a kind of will, that knowing oneself as perfect necessarily entails generating the best possible universe. But this defense convinced almost no one. Saying God's nature necessitates creation is not the same as saying God wills creation freely. It is the difference between choosing to give a gift and being forced to give it because of who you are. Second, and this is even more troubling, the emanation system cannot explain evil and suffering. Here is why. Each level of reality flows necessarily from the level above, according to perfect rational principles. The necessary being is perfectly good. The first intellect is nearly perfectly good, and so on down the chain. At no point does anyone choose to introduce evil, suffering, or imperfection. So where do they come from? Ibn Sina's answer is that evil is not a thing, it is an absence. Evil is privation, the lack of good, like darkness is the absence of light or cold is the absence of heat. As you descend the chain of emanation, getting further from the source, you get progressively more privation, more absence of perfection. Matter, at the bottom, is almost pure privation. It has minimal existence and maximal deficiency. But this answer fails completely when confronted with actual evil. A child dying of cancer is not experiencing an absence, they are experiencing something terribly positive and real: pain, destruction, loss. A genocidal war is not the privation of peace, it is the active presence of organized cruelty. Calling these things absences or privations is not philosophy, it is evasion. The contemporary philosopher Marilyn McCord Adams has devastated this kind of response. She argues that horrendous evils, evils so terrible they threaten to ruin the meaning of a person's entire life, cannot be explained away as mere absences. They are concretely, positively, overwhelmingly real to those who suffer them. Any philosophical system that denies their reality is not worth defending. Third, the emanation system makes God radically distant and unknowing. If everything flows through 10 levels of intermediaries, then God does not directly know or care about individual humans. The necessary being knows only itself. It does not know that you exist. It does not hear prayers. It does not intervene in history. God becomes an impersonal absolute, not a personal lord who loves and judges. This contradicts the entire spirit of Islamic devotional life, which assumes God is intimately aware of every sparrow that falls, every thought in every heart. Ibn Sina tried to argue that God knows particulars in a universal way, knowing all events through knowing universal principles. But this is clearly inadequate. Knowing humanity in general is not the same as knowing you specifically, your struggles, your grief, your prayers. Now here is what makes this fascinating. Ibn Sina knew all these problems. He was not stupid. He was not unaware of the theological implications. So why did he insist on emanation despite these devastating costs? Because he thought the alternative was worse. The alternative, as presented by the Islamic theologians called the mutakallimun, was that God creates through pure will with no rational necessity. God could have made the universe completely different, could have made 2 + 2 = 5, could have made murder virtuous and kindness evil. Nothing in God's nature constrains what he creates. Everything is pure, arbitrary choice. Ibn Sina found this picture horrifying. It makes the universe fundamentally irrational. It destroys the possibility of science and philosophy. If God's will is completely arbitrary, then there are no reliable patterns in nature, no laws we can discover, no rational structure we can investigate. Everything could change at any moment because God decided to will it differently. More than that, it makes God himself arbitrary and capricious. If God's choice to create this universe over another is not guided by any reasons, if it is just raw will with no rational basis, then God is not truly perfect. Perfection includes rationality. It includes choosing the best for the best reasons. A God of pure arbitrary will is not perfect. He is the cosmic equivalent of a tyrant who acts on whim. So Ibn Sina is caught between two impossibilities. Either God creates by necessity, which denies divine freedom and makes evil unexplainable, or God creates by arbitrary will, which makes the universe irrational and God himself imperfect. His solution, emanation, tries to thread the needle. It preserves the rationality of the universe while maintaining that everything flows from God's nature. But it does so at an enormous cost. It makes creation necessary, God distant, and evil a mystery that cannot be satisfactorily explained. The medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides, deeply influenced by Ibn Sina, tried to salvage the system by arguing that God's will and God's wisdom are identical, so that what God wills necessarily is also what wisdom demands. But this just restates the problem. It does not solve it. If what God wills is identical to what wisdom demands, then God still cannot do otherwise, which means creation is still necessary, not free. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, took Ibn Sina's framework, but modified it crucially. He agreed that God is the necessary being, and that everything else is contingent, but he insisted that God creates through free will, not necessary emanation. God knows all possible universes and freely chooses to actualize this one, not because he must, but because he wills it. This preserves divine freedom while maintaining that creation is rational, guided by God's perfect wisdom. But Aquinas' solution has its own problems. If God freely chooses this universe among infinite possible universes, and this universe contains horrendous evil, then God is choosing evil. You cannot say God merely permits evil, because God is actively choosing to actualize a universe where children get bone cancer, rather than a universe where they do not. That is not permission, that is selection. Modern philosophers like William Rowe have pressed this point ruthlessly. If God can create any universe, and chooses to create one with pointless suffering, suffering that serves no greater good, then God is either not all-powerful or not perfectly good. The existence of gratuitous evil, evil that could have been prevented without losing any greater good, seems incompatible with a perfect creator. Ibn Sina would respond, and here we see his genius even in failure, that there is no gratuitous evil in his system. Every evil is necessary as a logical consequence of matter's distance from the necessary being. The universe could not be better than it is, given that it must instantiate all levels of being from pure intellect down to pure matter. To remove any evil would be to remove a necessary link in the chain of emanation, which would make the universe less, not more, perfect. But this response is monstrous if you think about it. It means the suffering of every child, every torture, every genocide is metaphysically necessary for the universe to be complete. It transforms evil from a problem to be solved into a feature of cosmic perfection. This is not just philosophically problematic, it is morally obscene. And yet, Ibn Sina is asking a question that remains unanswered today. If you reject his system, if you insist on divine freedom and the contingency of creation, then you must explain why God creates a universe with this much suffering when he could have created one with less. You must explain why the free choice of a perfect being produces a world that looks frankly, deeply imperfect. The debate continues, unresolved after 1,000 years. No one has found a way to preserve divine perfection, divine freedom, the rationality of the universe, and the existence of evil all at once. Something has to give, and different philosophers sacrifice different pieces. Ibn Sina sacrificed freedom to preserve rationality and necessity. Others sacrifice rationality to preserve freedom, or sacrifice perfection to preserve both. What Ibn Sina forces us to confront is this: the problem of evil is not just a problem for theism, it is a problem for any metaphysical system that tries to ground reality in something perfect. Whether you call that ground God, the necessary being, or the universe itself, you must explain why reality is so far from perfect. And no one, in 1,000 years, has given an explanation that satisfies both the head and the heart. Part 3. The nature of the necessary being, what God must be if anything is. Now we go deeper into the most abstract and difficult part of Ibn Sina's system. What is the necessary being actually like? Not what we wish it were like, not what would be comforting to believe, but what it must be like if it is truly necessary, if existence is its very essence. The first thing Ibn Sina establishes is that the necessary being must be absolutely simple, without parts, without composition, without any internal complexity whatsoever. Here is why, and this argument is relentless. If something has parts, then it depends on those parts for its existence. A chair depends on its legs, its seat, its back. If you remove the parts, the chair ceases to exist. But the necessary being cannot depend on anything, because dependence means contingency, and contingency contradicts necessity. Therefore, the necessary being cannot have parts. But Ibn Sina goes further, and this is where it gets strange. The necessary being cannot even have a distinction between its essence and its attributes. When we say God is powerful and wise and good, we might think these are different properties that God has, like someone might have brown hair and blue eyes. But that would introduce composition into God's nature. It would mean God is a compound of power plus wisdom plus goodness. Instead, Ibn Sina argues, in God, power and wisdom and goodness are all identical to each other and identical to God's essence. God is not powerful, wise and good. God is power itself, wisdom itself, goodness itself, and these are all the same thing seen from different angles. This is what theologians call divine simplicity, and it is profoundly counterintuitive. Think about what this means in practice. When we say God knows something, we are not saying God has knowledge the way you have knowledge, as an attribute attached to a subject. God is knowledge, God's entire being is identical with the act of knowing. There is no God who then knows, there is only knowing that is God. The same applies to willing, to creating, to being. These are not things God does or has. These are what God is. The medieval philosopher and theologian Moses Maimonides, deeply influenced by Ibn Sina, took this to its radical conclusion. He argued that we cannot say anything positive about God at all. Every positive statement, God is wise, introduces a distinction between God and wisdom, between subject and predicate. The only thing we can say truthfully is what God is not. God is not limited, not composite, not changeable, not material. This is called negative theology, and it makes God radically unknowable. But here is the problem that makes this unbearable. If God is absolutely simple, without distinctions or complexity, then how can God know multiple things? Knowledge requires distinction. To know that 2 + 2 = 4 is different from knowing that the sky is blue. These are different pieces of knowledge with different content. But if God is absolutely simple, without any internal distinctions, how can God's knowledge contain multiple truths? Ibn Sina's answer is both brilliant and unsatisfying. God knows all things by knowing himself. Because God is the source of all existence, knowing his own nature perfectly means knowing everything that flows from that nature. God knows the universe the way a geometer knows all possible triangles by understanding the definition of triangle. It is a single unified act of knowledge that somehow contains all particularity within it. But this creates a devastating problem for divine providence and prayer. If God knows things only by knowing universal principles through knowing himself, then God does not know you as an individual. God knows humanity in general, knows the universal nature of human beings, but your specific existence, your particular struggles, your individual prayers, these are not known to God in any meaningful sense. Al-Ghazali attacked this mercilessly. He said, "Your system makes prayer absurd, Ibn Sina. If God does not know me individually, then praying to God is like praying to the laws of mathematics. The laws are real and govern reality, but they do not hear you. They do not care. They cannot respond. You have turned the personal God of religion into an impersonal absolute principle." Ibn Sina tried to defend himself by distinguishing between God's knowledge of things through their universal causes and God's knowledge of things in their particularity. He argued that God knows the particulars through knowing the universal principles that determine them, like knowing every drop of rain by knowing the laws of meteorology. But this defense collapses under scrutiny. Knowing the universal principles that produce an event is not the same as knowing the event itself in its concrete particularity. The laws of meteorology do not tell you that this specific raindrop fell on your face at exactly 3:15 on Tuesday afternoon while you were feeling sad. Universal knowledge and particular knowledge are different kinds of knowledge, and if God only has the first, then he lacks the second. The contemporary philosopher of religion, Richard Swinburne, has pressed this point in modern terms. He argues that omniscience requires knowing all truths, including irreducibly indexical truths, truths that cannot be reduced to universal principles. The truth that I am here now experiencing this is not derivable from any set of general laws. If God does not know indexical truths, if God does not know the world from the inside as we do, then God is not truly omniscient. But Ibn Sina has a deeper reason for resisting the idea that God knows particulars as particulars, and it reveals something profound about his entire system. If God knows particulars in their constant change, then God's knowledge must be constantly changing. God must learn new truths moment by moment as the universe unfolds. But change introduces temporality into God. It makes God exist in time rather than outside time. And if God exists in time, then God is not truly necessary, because temporal things are contingent, they come into and pass out of existence. Here we see the core tension in Ibn Sina's thought, the tension between a God who is religiously adequate, who knows and loves and responds to prayer, and a God who is metaphysically necessary, who is simple, eternal, unchanging. These two conceptions pull in opposite directions. The more you make God metaphysically perfect, the less God can be personally engaged with the world. The more you make God personally engaged, the less God can be absolutely necessary. This tension is not unique to Ibn Sina, it haunts all of classical theism. But Ibn Sina felt it more acutely than most because he was trying to be rigorous, trying to follow the logic wherever it led, even when it led to religiously uncomfortable conclusions. Now let us turn to another attribute of the necessary being, immateriality. The necessary being cannot be material, cannot have a body, cannot exist in space. Why? Because matter is composite, it has parts. It has form and matter as its constituents, and we have already established that the necessary being must be absolutely simple. Therefore, the necessary being must be pure immaterial intellect, pure thought-thinking itself. But this raises a question that has troubled philosophers for millennia. How does an immaterial being cause material effects? How does pure thought, something with no physical properties whatsoever, reach out and affect physical things? This is the mind-body problem writ large, applied not to human consciousness but to divine causation. Ibn Sina's answer involves the chain of emanation we discussed earlier. The necessary being does not directly cause material effects. Instead, it produces the first immaterial intellect, which produces the second and so on down the chain until you reach the active intellect, which then governs the material world. At each stage the causation becomes more indirect, more mediated, until finally material things emerge at the bottom of the cosmic hierarchy. But this solution is unsatisfying because it just multiplies the mystery. Now you have not one but 10 instances of immaterial beings somehow causing effects in lower levels of reality. How does the first intellect cause the second? How does the active intellect govern matter? The problem has been redistributed, not solved. Modern philosophers of mind face a similar problem when they try to explain how consciousness, which seems immaterial, can cause physical brain states to change. Some, like Daniel Dennett, deny that consciousness is immaterial at all. It is just a complex physical process that we misunderstand. Others, like David Chalmers, bite the bullet and accept that consciousness is genuinely immaterial, but insist it can still causally interact with matter through psychophysical laws we do not yet understand. Ibn Sina, for his part, never satisfactorily solved this problem. One final attribute of the necessary being that Ibn Sina insists on is eternity, not in the sense of existing at all times, but in the sense of existing outside of time altogether. The necessary being does not endure through time, does not wait, does not experience before and after. Instead, the necessary being exists in what medieval philosophers called the eternal now, a single, timeless present that encompasses all of time from outside. This is almost impossible for us to imagine. Our entire experience is structured by temporality, by the flow from past through present to future. To conceive of existence without that structure, to imagine a being for whom all moments are simultaneously present, is to reach the limits of human understanding. But Ibn Sina argues this must be the case. If the necessary being existed in time, then time would be prior to it, and the necessary being would depend on time for its existence. But the necessary being cannot depend on anything. Therefore, it must be outside of time. eternal in the absolute sense. This has bizarre implications for divine action. If God is outside of time, then from God's perspective there is no sequence of events. Creation does not happen, and then later other things happen. Instead, all of history, from the Big Bang to the heat-death of the universe, is simultaneously present to God in one eternal act. God does not react to events, does not decide to intervene at specific moments, because for God there are no moments, there is only the eternal now. The contemporary philosopher Eleanor Stump has tried to make sense of this by arguing that God exists in what she calls eternity, which is not the same as a temporality. In eternity, all of time is present, but not as a static block. Instead, God experiences all moments simultaneously, but still in their proper order. This is supposed to preserve both divine timelessness and divine awareness of temporal sequence, but most philosophers find it incoherent. You cannot have sequence without time. The concepts are inseparable. What emerges from all this is a picture of the necessary being that is philosophically rigorous but religiously alienating. The God of Ibn Sina is perfect, necessary, eternal, simple, immaterial, and absolutely transcendent. But this God does not listen to prayers, does not intervene in history, does not know you individually, and does not change in response to your actions. This is a God you can contemplate and philosophically prove, but not a God you can love or be loved by. And Ibn Sina knew this. He was caught in the terrible tension between what philosophy demands and what religion needs. He tried to hold both together, but the seams show. The God of the philosophers and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Muhammad are not easily reconciled, and Ibn Sina's system reveals the strain of trying to force them into one coherent picture. This tension would explode in the centuries after Ibn Sina, dividing Islamic philosophy into two camps: those who prioritized philosophical rigor even at the cost of religious adequacy, and those who abandoned philosophical theology altogether in favor of faith and mysticism. But that is a story for later parts. For now, recognize what Ibn Sina has shown us, that if God exists and is truly necessary, truly the ground of all being, then God must be radically unlike anything in our experience. God must be so different from us that our ordinary concepts barely apply. Whether this makes God more sublime or simply more distant is a question each person must answer for themselves. Part 4. The Flying Man. How Ibn Sina proved you are not your body. We now turn to Ibn Sina's most famous thought experiment, one so powerful that it anticipated modern philosophy of mind by 600 years. It is called the Flying Man argument, and it attempts to prove that you are not identical to your body, that consciousness is something distinct from physical matter. Here is the thought experiment. Imagine Ibn Sina says that you are created all at once, fully formed but suspended in the air. You cannot see or touch anything. You feel no wind, no heat, no cold. Your limbs are spread apart, so you do not feel them touching each other. You have no sensory input whatsoever. No sight, no sound, no touch, no smell, no taste. You are in complete sensory deprivation from the moment of your existence. Now here's the question: in this state, would you still be aware that you exist? Ibn Sina says yes, absolutely. You would still have immediate self-awareness. You would still know that you are, even though you know nothing about your body, nothing about the external world, nothing about your physical properties. But here is the crucial next step. If you can be aware of your own existence without being aware of your body, then yourself, your consciousness, cannot be identical to your body. If they were identical, you could not know one without knowing the other. Therefore, You and your body must be distinct things. You are a soul or self that exists independently of bodily awareness. This argument is elegant, simple, and has influenced everyone from Descartes to contemporary philosophers of mind. Descartes' famous cogito argument, I think therefore I am, is essentially a variation of Ibn Sina's flying man. Both use the indubitability of self-awareness to establish the existence of a thinking substance distinct from the body. But is the argument actually sound? This is where things get contentious. The first objection, raised by materialist philosophers, ancient and modern, is that Ibn Sina confuses epistemic distinction with metaphysical distinction. Just because you can think about X without thinking about Y does not mean X and Y are actually different things. Here's an example. Imagine someone who does not know that water is H2O. They can think about water without thinking about H2O. They can be certain water exists while doubting whether H2O exists. But water and H2O are not actually two different things. They are the same thing under different descriptions. The epistemic distinction does not prove a metaphysical distinction. Similarly, the materialist argues, you can be aware of yourself without being aware of your body, not because you and your body are different things, but because you know yourself under one description, immediate self-awareness, and your body under another description, external observation. You are your body, but you have two different ways of accessing that fact, from the inside and from the outside. The contemporary philosopher Daniel Dennett makes this argument forcefully. He says consciousness is a physical process occurring in the brain, but we have a special kind of access to it, introspection, that does not reveal its physical nature. When you think about your consciousness, you are thinking about your brain, but you are thinking about it introspectively rather than scientifically, so it does not seem like a physical thing. This is an illusion created by the way we access information about ourselves. Ibn Sina has a response to this, and it is clever. He would say the flying man is not just unaware of his body's properties, he is in a state where he could not possibly infer that he has a body at all. Given zero sensory input, there is no evidence, no data from which to conclude that a body exists, and yet self-awareness persists. This suggests that self-awareness does not depend on having a body, even in principle. But the materialist can respond. Just because the flying man has no evidence of his body does not mean he does not have one. Introspection gives you access to mental states, but does not give you access to the physical substrate that produces them. When you introspect, you are detecting brain activity, but introspection is not designed to tell you that. It just gives you the subjective character of experience, what it is like to be you. So the flying man's inability to detect his body through introspection proves nothing about whether he actually has one. This debate remains unresolved in contemporary philosophy of mind. Philosophers who believe in dualism, the view that mind and body are distinct substances, find Ibn Sina's argument compelling. Philosophers who believe in materialism or physicalism, the view that everything is ultimately physical, think the argument makes an elementary logical error. But there is a second, deeper problem with Ibn Sina's argument, one that strikes at its very foundation. The argument assumes that self-awareness is infallible, that when you are aware of yourself you cannot be mistaken about your own existence. But is this true? The philosopher David Hume, writing in the 18th century, challenged this assumption directly. He said, "When I introspect, when I look into my own mind, I never find a self. I only find particular perceptions, thoughts, feelings, sensations. I find anger, sadness, hunger, memories, but I never find a thing called the self that has these experiences. The self, Hume argued, is a fiction, a story we tell ourselves to connect the bundle of experiences together. If Hume is right, then Ibn Sina's flying man is confused. What the flying man is aware of is not a self, not a substantial soul, but just the bare fact of having experiences. There is experiencing happening, but there is no experiencer behind it, no subject separate from the experiences themselves. The self is just the experiences bundled together, not a separate thing that has them. This Buddhist view, which predates both Ibn Sina and Hume, denies that there is any permanent, unchanging self at all. What we call the self is a process, a constantly changing flow of mental events, not a substance. The flying man's sense of self-awareness is real, but it does not point to a substantial soul. It points to the ongoing process of consciousness generating the illusion of a unified subject. Ibn Sina would reject this vehemently. He would argue that you cannot have experiences without an experiencer, that the very idea of experience presupposes a subject who has the experience. If there are thoughts, there must be a thinker. If there are perceptions, there must be a perceiver. The subject cannot be reduced to the bundle of experiences because the bundle requires something to unify it, to be the one to whom all these experiences belong. But Hume and the Buddhists have a counter-argument. The sense of unity is itself just another experience in the bundle. When you feel like you are a unified self persisting through time, that feeling is itself a mental event, not a perception of a real underlying substance. The self model, the brain's representation of itself as a unified agent, is mistaken for the actual self. We are not selves who have experiences, we are processes that generate the illusion of being selves. Now, here is where Ibn Sina's argument becomes personally urgent, not just theoretically interesting. If Ibn Sina is right, if you are a soul distinct from your body, then what you fundamentally are might survive the death of your body. Your consciousness, yourself, might continue even after your brain ceases to function, after your body decays. This opens the door to immortality, to an afterlife, to the survival of personal identity beyond death. But if the materialists are right, if you are identical to your body and brain, then when your brain dies, you cease to exist. There is nothing left to survive, no soul to continue, just the dissolution of the physical processes that constituted your consciousness. Death is annihilation, not transition. Ibn Sina was acutely aware of these stakes. His entire ethical system, his account of human purpose and happiness, depends on the soul's immortality. If the soul is just the body under a different description, then everything he says about the afterlife, about the soul's return to its source, about eternal happiness in union with the divine intellect, collapses. And this brings us to a final, devastating problem with the flying man argument. Even if it proves that you are distinct from your body, it does not prove that you can survive without your body. Perhaps the soul is distinct from the body, but still depends on the body to exist, the way a song is distinct from a CD, but still requires some physical medium to exist. This is the view of many contemporary philosophers of mind who accept property dualism but reject substance dualism. They argue that mental properties like consciousness and thought are not reducible to physical properties, but they are still produced by and dependent on physical brains. When the brain dies, the mental properties cease to exist, even though they were not identical to brain states. Ibn Sina tried to argue that the soul must be capable of independent existence because it can perform operations that do not require the body, like abstract reasoning and self-reflection. The body is needed for sensation and imagination, but pure intellection, thinking about universals and necessary truths, is an immaterial operation. Since the soul can perform immaterial operations, it must be an immaterial substance capable of existing without the body. But this argument assumes that there are genuinely immaterial operations, and that is precisely what materialists deny. They argue that even abstract reasoning is a physical process, a computation performed by neurons firing in specific patterns. Just because reasoning feels non-physical to us does not mean it actually is non-physical. It just means our introspective access does not reveal the underlying mechanism. So where does this leave us? The flying man argument remains one of the most influential thought experiments in the history of philosophy, but it has not settled the debate. Dualists find it convincing, materialists find it fallacious, and property dualists think it proves something important, but less than Ibn Sina intended. What Ibn Sina forces us to confront is this: the nature of consciousness remains deeply mysterious. We have immediate, indubitable awareness of our own existence, but we do not have clear answers about what we are. Are we physical beings with an illusory sense of non-physical selfhood? Are we non-physical souls, temporarily embodied? Are we something stranger still, processes that transcend the physical-mental distinction altogether? After 1,000 years, we're still arguing. And Ibn Sina's flying man still hovers in the air, still sensing his own existence, still demanding that we answer the question, what am I? Part 5. The Soul, What You Actually Are According to Ibn Sina. Having established that you are not your body, Ibn Sina now faces the harder question, what are you exactly? What is this soul that persists, that thinks, that is aware of itself? And how does it relate to the body it temporarily inhabits? Ibn Sina's answer is complex, nuanced, and frankly contradictory in places. He wants to avoid two extremes. On one side is Plato's view that the soul is a completely separate substance trapped in the body like a prisoner in a cell, waiting to escape. On the other side is Aristotle's view that the soul is just the form of the body, the organizational principle that makes a living thing alive, inseparable from matter. Ibn Sina tries to synthesize these views, taking elements from both while rejecting their extremes. He agrees with Aristotle that the soul is the form of the body, but he agrees with Plato that the rational soul can exist independently of matter. This sounds like a contradiction, and in many ways it is, but Ibn Sina thinks he can make it work. Here is his picture. The human soul has multiple levels or faculties, arranged hierarchically from lowest to highest. At the bottom is the vegetative soul, the principle that governs nutrition, growth, and reproduction. This is what plants have. It is the most basic form of life. Next is the animal soul, which adds sensation, imagination, memory, and locomotion. This is what animals have in addition to the vegetative functions. Finally, at the top is the rational soul, the capacity for abstract thought, universal concepts, and self-awareness. This is uniquely human. Now here is the crucial distinction. The vegetative and animal souls are material forms. They cannot exist without the body. They are inseparable from physical organs. When the body dies, these souls cease to exist. They dissolve back into matter. But the rational soul is different. It is an immaterial substance that uses the body but does not depend on it for its existence. When the body dies, the rational soul continues. It survives and persists. But this raises an immediate problem. If the rational soul is immaterial, how does it interact with the material body? How does an immaterial mind cause a material arm to move? How does a material eye send information to an immaterial consciousness? This is the mind-body problem again, and Ibn Sina never solved it satisfactorily. His answer involves the internal senses, a complex system of intermediate faculties that mediate between body and soul. There is common sense, which integrates information from the 5 external senses into unified perceptions. There is imagination, which stores and manipulates sensory images. There is the estimative faculty, which apprehends non-sensory meanings like danger or affection. And there is memory, which stores these meanings over time. These internal senses are partly material, located in the brain, but also partly immaterial because they process meanings and not just physical stimuli. They form a bridge between the physical body and the immaterial, rational soul. But this is more a description of the problem than a solution. Saying there is a bridge does not explain how the bridge actually works, how immaterial and material causally interact. Now let us talk about how the soul comes into existence, and here Ibn Sina says something shocking. The rational soul is not pre-existent, it does not exist before the body, contrary to Plato. Instead, the rational soul is created, brought into existence, at some point during embryonic development when the fetus reaches a certain level of bodily complexity. But who creates it? Not the parents, they only contribute matter and the vegetative and animal souls. The rational soul must be created by something already immaterial and intellectual, and that is the active intellect, the lowest of the cosmic intellects in the chain of emanation. When a human body reaches sufficient complexity, the active intellect emanates a rational soul into it. This raises a devastating problem for personal identity. If your rational soul was created at some point during your development, not at conception but later, then what were you before that? Were you not yet a person? And when exactly does ensoulment happen? Ibn Sina is vague on this, and for good reason. There is no non-arbitrary answer. Modern embryology makes this even more problematic. We now know that there is no clear threshold of complexity. Development is continuous and gradual. At what point does the fetus become complex enough to warrant a rational soul? 8 weeks? 12 weeks? At birth? Any answer seems arbitrary. Yet Ibn Sina's system requires a precise moment when the immaterial soul is injected into the material body. Now let us examine what the rational soul actually does, what makes it distinctively rational. Ibn Sina says the rational soul has 2 main functions, theoretical reason and practical reason. Theoretical reason is the capacity to grasp universal truths, necessary propositions, abstract concepts. When you understand that 2 + 2 = 4, or that all triangles have 3 sides, you are using theoretical reason. These truths are not derived from sensory experience, they are grasped by the intellect directly through its contact with the active intellect. Here is how it works in Ibn Sina's system. Your mind does not contain actual universal concepts innately, it only has the potential to think them. When you encounter particulars through sensation, your mind prepares itself to receive the universal form. Then the active intellect, which contains all universal forms, actually illuminates your mind, and you suddenly grasp the universal. Learning is not remembering what you already knew, as Plato thought, and it is not extracting universals from particulars through abstraction, as Aristotle thought. It is receiving illumination from the active intellect. This is Ibn Sina's famous theory of illumination, and it was massively influential in medieval philosophy. But it has serious problems. If all knowledge comes from outside, from the active intellect beaming concepts into your mind, then in what sense is learning an achievement? You are not discovering anything, you are just being a passive receiver of transmissions from a cosmic intellect. This seems to eliminate genuine intellectual agency. Moreover, if the active intellect is one and the same for all humans, then how do we account for individual differences in understanding? Why do some people grasp concepts quickly and others slowly? Why do some people understand deeply and others superficially? Ibn Sina tries to explain this by saying that different souls have different levels of receptivity based on their bodily preparation. But this makes knowledge dependent on matter again, which contradicts the immateriality of the rational soul. The alternative view, held by later philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, is that the human intellect actively abstracts universals from particulars through its own power. We do not need illumination from outside. We have an agent intellect within us that performs abstraction. This preserves intellectual agency, but raises its own problems. How can an immaterial intellect abstract forms from material objects? What is abstraction as a causal process? Practical reason, the second function of the rational soul, is the capacity to deliberate about action, to choose, to govern behavior according to rational principles. This is the seat of free will, of moral responsibility, of ethical judgment. But here, Ibn Sina faces a problem that has never been satisfactorily solved. If the rational soul makes free choices, then it must not be fully determined by prior causes. But if it is not determined, then its choices are random, arbitrary, uncaused. How can you be responsible for choices that are not caused by your character, your reasons, your values? But if they are caused by those things, then they are determined, not free. Ibn Sina tries to navigate between determinism and randomness by saying that the rational soul is self-determining. It is the cause of its own choices, not caused by external factors, but also not uncaused, caused by itself. But this is obscure. What does it mean to be the cause of your own choices? If you choose based on reasons, then the reasons cause the choice, not you independently of reasons. If you choose without reasons, then the choice is arbitrary. The contemporary philosopher Robert Caine has tried to develop a sophisticated version of this libertarian free will, arguing that free choices involve what he calls self-forming actions, moments where multiple options are genuinely open and the agent resolves the indeterminacy through an act of will. But critics argue this still does not explain how the will resolves indeterminacy without either being determined or being random. Now we come to the fate of the soul after death, and here Ibn Sina's view is both beautiful and terrifying. When the body dies, the rational soul separates and continues to exist. But what happens to it depends entirely on what kind of soul it became during bodily life. Souls that cultivated theoretical knowledge, that achieved union with the active intellect through philosophical contemplation, experience supreme happiness. They exist in a state of continuous intellectual joy, forever contemplating eternal truths in union with the divine intellect. This is the highest form of human fulfillment, the purpose for which we exist. Souls that remained attached to bodily pleasures, that never developed their rational capacities, experience torment, not because they are punished by God, but because they are frustrated. They still desire bodily pleasures, but have no body with which to satisfy those desires. They are in a state of perpetual craving with no possibility of satisfaction, which is a kind of hell. And here is the truly disturbing part. For Ibn Sina, this state is eternal. Once the soul is separated from the body, it cannot change, cannot develop, cannot repent or improve. Its character is fixed permanently. If you died as a philosophical soul, you are eternally happy. If you died as a sensual soul, you are eternally frustrated. There is no redemption, no second chances, no divine mercy that intervenes to save lost souls. This is in deep tension with Islamic theology, which emphasizes God's mercy and the possibility of repentance even at the last moment. Ibn Sina's system makes the afterlife mechanical, determined by your level of intellectual development at death, with no room for grace or forgiveness. But there is an even deeper problem with Ibn Sina's account of the afterlife, the problem of personal identity. If the rational soul is all that survives, stripped of memory, imagination, sensory experience, bodily feelings, then in what sense is it still you? The rational soul has no particular memories, it only retains universal knowledge. It has no personality, no individual characteristics, no sense of itself as having lived a particular life. What survives might be a soul, but it is not clear it is your soul in any meaningful sense. This problem has been pressed by many critics, both medieval and modern. If what survives death lacks the psychological continuity that makes you you, if it does not remember your life, does not have your personality, does not recognize itself as the person who lived, then the survival of the rational soul provides no comfort. It is a kind of impersonal immortality, not the survival of you as an individual. Ibn Sina was aware of this problem but never adequately addressed it. He insisted that the rational soul retains a kind of individual identity, but he could not explain what constitutes that identity, if not memory and personality. This remains an unresolved tension in his psychology. Finally, we must address the unity of the soul. Ibn Sina insists that despite having multiple faculties, the soul is ultimately one thing, not a collection of separate parts. The vegetative, animal and rational functions are all expressions of a single substance viewed from different angles. But this raises the question, what unifies them? What makes them all aspects of one soul rather than three separate souls accidentally conjoined? Ibn Sina's answer is that the higher faculties contain and perfect the lower ones. The rational soul includes the animal functions and directs them toward rational ends. The animal soul includes the vegetative functions and organizes them for sensation and movement. The soul is unified because it is a hierarchy, not a democracy, with the rational soul at the apex governing everything below it. But this picture of the soul as a hierarchy breaks down in practice. Often our rational judgments are overridden by emotion, our animal desires defeat our rational plans. If the rational soul truly governed the whole person, how could this happen? Ibn Sina would say it happens when the soul is weak, when it has not fully developed its rational capacities. But this seems to undermine the claim that the rational soul is the form of the whole person. If it can be present but impotent, it is not really governing the organism. What emerges from Ibn Sina's psychology is a deeply dualistic picture, despite his attempts to synthesize Plato and Aristotle. The rational soul is ultimately separate from the body, uses the body as an instrument, and will eventually leave the body behind. This is much closer to Plato than to Aristotle, despite Ibn Sina's explicit claims otherwise. And this matters for how we think about human nature and ethics. If you are essentially a rational soul temporarily embodied, then the body is not really you, it is just a tool, or a prison, depending on how you view it. This can lead to a devaluation of bodily needs, of physical pleasure, of embodied relationships in favor of pure intellectual contemplation. Ibn Sina's ideal human is the philosopher who transcends bodily concerns and lives in pure thought. But is this really the fullness of human life? Or is it a denial of our embodied social emotional nature in favor of an abstract intellectualism? Many critics, ancient and modern, have argued that Ibn Sina's psychology is profoundly anti-human, that it demands we stop being the creatures we are in pursuit of an impossible and undesirable ideal. Part 6. How we know anything, Ibn Sina's theory of knowledge and why it fails. Now we arrive at perhaps the most important question in all of philosophy. How do we know anything? How can we be certain that our beliefs correspond to reality and are not just illusions, errors, or useful fictions? Ibn Sina builds an elaborate epistemology, a theory of knowledge that tries to ground certainty in rational intuition and necessary truths, but it has fatal flaws that he never fully addressed. Ibn Sina begins with a classification of knowledge types. At the lowest level is sensory knowledge, what we learn through the five senses, seeing colours, hearing sounds, feeling textures. This is particular and concrete, tied to specific objects at specific times. Above this is imaginative knowledge, the ability to form and manipulate mental images derived from sensation. Then comes estimative knowledge, the non-sensory apprehension of meanings like danger or benefit. This is what a sheep exercises when it fears a wolf, even on first sight. Finally, at the highest level is intellectual knowledge, the grasp of universal concepts and necessary truths. The question is, which of these provides certainty? Ibn Sina argues that only intellectual knowledge can give us absolute certainty, and only in specific cases. Sensory knowledge is inherently fallible. The senses can deceive, can be mistaken, can present illusions. The stick looks bent in water but is not. The distant tower looks round but is square. We cannot build certainty on sensation alone. But intellectual knowledge of necessary truths is different. When you understand that the whole is greater than the part, or that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time, or that 2 + 2 = 4, you grasp something that cannot be false. These are not just beliefs that happen to be true, they are truths that must be true, that could not possibly be otherwise. And when you grasp a necessary truth, you grasp it with certainty. You cannot coherently doubt it, even if you try. Ibn Sina calls these primary principles, or first intelligibles. They are self-evident truths that do not need proof, and cannot be doubted by anyone who understands them. Examples include the law of non-contradiction, the principle that every event has a cause, the axioms of mathematics, and certain logical principles. These form the foundation of all knowledge. Everything else we know must be derived from or grounded in these first principles. But here is where the problems start. How do we know that these so-called self-evident truths are actually true? Just because we cannot help believing something does not mean it is true. It might just mean our minds are structured in a way that forces us to believe it. We might be prisoners of our cognitive architecture, unable to think differently, even though reality actually is different. The philosopher Descartes, writing 600 years after Ibn Sina, raised this worry in its most acute form. He imagined an evil demon who created us with systematically deceiving minds, minds that take falsehood for truth, that cannot help believing what is false. How do we know we are not in that situation? How do we know that our sense of self-evidence tracks truth rather than just reflecting how our minds happen to work? Ibn Sina would respond that this kind of radical skepticism is incoherent. To doubt everything, including the principles of logic, is to make doubt itself impossible. If you doubt the law of non-contradiction, then you cannot distinguish between doubting and not doubting, between truth and falsehood, between anything and anything else. Radical skepticism destroys itself, it collapses into meaninglessness. But this response is not fully satisfying. The skeptic can grant that we must assume certain principles in order to think at all, but still ask whether those principles reflect reality or just the structure of thought. Perhaps we are trapped inside a conceptual scheme that does not correspond to how things really are. We have to think in certain ways, but that does not mean reality has to be those ways. The contemporary philosopher Hilary Putnam pressed this issue with his famous brain-in-a-vat thought experiment. How do you know you are not a brain in a vat being fed simulated experiences by a supercomputer? Everything would seem the same to you. All your beliefs would feel just as certain, but they would all be false. You cannot appeal to your sense of certainty to rule this out, because the brain in the vat would have exactly the same sense of certainty. Ibn Sina never confronted this level of skepticism because it was not a live option in his intellectual context. Medieval philosophers assumed that God would not create minds systematically deceived about basic truths, that divine goodness guarantees the reliability of properly functioning reason. But once you remove that assumption, once you allow that our minds might be unreliable even about what seems self-evident, Ibn Sina's foundation crumbles. Let us move to a second major problem with Ibn Sina's epistemology, the role of the active intellect. Remember that Ibn Sina thinks we learn universal truths not by abstracting them from experience, but by receiving illumination from the active intellect when our minds are properly prepared. The active intellect contains all universal forms, actually, and transmits them to individual human minds when those minds are ready. But this raises a devastating question. How do you know when you have received genuine illumination versus when you are just imagining or inventing ideas? If knowledge comes from outside, from a cosmic intellect beaming concepts into your mind, then you need some way to distinguish genuine reception from delusion. What is the criterion? Ibn Sina says that genuine knowledge has a quality of necessity and self-evidence that mere imagination lacks. When you truly understand a universal truth, you see that it must be so, whereas imagined ideas feel contingent and uncertain. But this cannot be the criterion, because people often feel certain about things that are false. History is full of beliefs that felt self-evident to their believers, but turned out to be wrong. Aristotelian physics felt self-evident for 2,000 years, but was overturned by Newtonian mechanics, which felt self-evident for 300 years, but was overturned by relativity and quantum mechanics. The subjective feeling of necessity is not a reliable guide to truth. And if that is all Ibn Sina can offer as a criterion for genuine illumination, then his epistemology provides no protection against error. A third problem concerns empirical knowledge. Knowledge of the physical world derived from sensory experience. Ibn Sina acknowledges that we learn about particular physical facts through sensation, but he thinks this knowledge is always uncertain and fallible. We can never be absolutely certain that the physical world is as it appears to us, because the senses can deceive. But then, how can we have science? How can we have reliable knowledge of nature if all empirical observation is inherently uncertain? Ibn Sina's answer is that science deals with universals, not particulars. Scientific knowledge is knowledge of necessary connections between essences, not knowledge of particular contingent facts. When you know that fire necessarily heats, you are not knowing a particular instance of fire heating a particular object. You are knowing a universal truth about the nature of fire. But this picture of science is completely wrong. And Ibn Sina should have known this, given his own scientific practice. Science proceeds by observation, experimentation, hypothesis testing, not by contemplating essences. You do not learn that fire heats by thinking about the essence of fire. You learn it by observing particular instances of fire heating things. And the universal claim that all fire heats is not a necessary truth, known through intellectual intuition. It is an empirical generalization that might be false. We could discover types of fire that do not heat, or contexts where fire fails to heat, and this would not involve a logical contradiction. Ibn Sina's epistemology cannot account for genuine empirical science because it assumes all real knowledge must be certain, necessary, and grasped through intellectual intuition. But empirical knowledge is not like this. It is tentative, probabilistic, revisable in light of new evidence. The success of modern science depends precisely on abandoning Ibn Sina's demand for absolute certainty and accepting that empirical knowledge is always provisional. A fourth problem, perhaps the most devastating, is the problem of induction. Even if we grant that we can know particular facts through observation, how do we move from observed instances to universal generalizations? You have seen 1,000 crows and all were black. But how do you know the next crow will be black? How do you know all crows are black? The past does not logically necessitate the future. No contradiction would arise if the next crow turned out to be white. Ibn Sina never addressed this problem seriously. He assumed that if you observe enough instances of a pattern, the universal form behind it becomes evident to the intellect through illumination from the active intellect. But this is no solution, it just relocates the mystery. How does the active intellect know that the pattern will continue? And how does it communicate this to your mind reliably? The philosopher David Hume, writing 6 centuries after Ibn Sina, showed that induction cannot be rationally justified. We believe that the future will resemble the past, but this belief itself is based on induction, on observing that in the past the future has resembled the past. This is circular reasoning. It assumes what it is trying to prove. We have no rational foundation for inductive inference. We just have a psychological habit of expecting patterns to continue. If Hume is right, then most of what we think we know about the empirical world is not knowledge at all. It is just firmly held belief without rational justification. And Ibn Sina's epistemology, which demands rational certainty for genuine knowledge, would have to admit that we know almost nothing about the physical world. Now let us turn to a practical problem with Ibn Sina's epistemology, the problem of disagreement. If certain truths are self-evident to properly functioning minds, why do people disagree about so much? Why do intelligent, educated, rational people come to contradictory conclusions about fundamental questions? If knowledge comes from the active intellect illuminating prepared minds, why does it not produce consensus? Ibn Sina's answer is that most people's minds are not properly prepared. They are clouded by passion, prejudice, attachment to authority, or simple lack of intellectual training. Only philosophers who have purified their minds through disciplined study can reliably receive illumination. Everyone else is getting distorted or partial transmissions, but this is elitist and question-begging. It assumes that anyone who disagrees with Ibn Sina must be irrational or unprepared, rather than considering that maybe Ibn Sina himself is wrong. It makes the philosopher's views unassailable by definition, which is exactly what you would expect from a system that privileges intellectual intuition over empirical evidence and intersubjective verification. Moreover, philosophers disagree with each other constantly, often more than non-philosophers do. Ibn Sina disagreed with Aristotle, with Plotinus, with Al-Farabi, and his own students disagreed with him. If philosophical training prepares the mind to receive true illumination, why does it not produce agreement among the trained? The presence of persistent philosophical disagreement suggests that intellectual intuition is not the reliable guide to truth that Ibn Sina claims. Contemporary epistemology has largely moved away from Ibn Sina's foundationalist approach, the idea that knowledge must be built on a foundation of self-evident truths. Instead, most epistemologists accept some form of coherentism or reliabilism. Coherentism says that beliefs are justified if they fit together into a coherent system without needing an indubitable foundation. Reliabilism says that beliefs are justified if they are produced by reliable cognitive processes, even if those processes do not yield certainty. These approaches give up on Ibn Sina's demand for absolute certainty, accepting instead that human knowledge is fallible and revisable. But they better account for actual scientific practice and the reality of persistent disagreement. Finally, we must address the normative dimension of Ibn Sina's epistemology, the claim that we have a duty to pursue knowledge, especially philosophical knowledge. Ibn Sina thinks that intellectual perfection is the human good, that we fulfill our nature by developing our rational capacities to their maximum extent. The life of philosophical contemplation is the best life, the life most worth living. But why should we accept this? Many people find fulfillment in activities that have nothing to do with abstract philosophical contemplation, in relationships, in creative work, in physical challenges, in social engagement. Is Ibn Sina saying that all these lives are inferior, that anyone not pursuing philosophical wisdom is wasting their life? This is a form of intellectualism that many contemporary philosophers reject. The good life for humans is plural. There are many different ways to live well, and philosophical contemplation is just one option among others, not the uniquely best way. Ibn Sina's epistemology smuggles in a controversial ethical claim about human flourishing and presents it as if it were a metaphysical necessity. In the end, Ibn Sina's theory of knowledge cannot deliver what it promises, absolute certainty grounded in self-evident rational intuition. It fails to account for the fallibility of even our most basic beliefs, the problem of induction, the reality of persistent disagreement, and the nature of empirical science. What remains valuable is his insistence that we can know some things with more certainty than others, that there is a hierarchy of knowledge from the sensory to the intellectual. But the specific mechanism he proposes, illumination from the active intellect, is indefensible, and his demand for absolute certainty is both unachievable and unnecessary. Part 7. Causation and the structure of reality, how everything is connected. We now examine what might be Ibn Sina's most important contribution to metaphysics beyond the essence-existence distinction, his sophisticated analysis of causation. What does it mean for one thing to cause another? What kinds of causes are there? And what does the structure of causation reveal about the nature of reality itself? Ibn Sina inherits from Aristotle a framework of 4 causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. But he develops and refines this framework in ways that were massively influential and in ways that reveal both the power and the limitations of medieval metaphysics. Let us start with material causation. The material cause is the stuff something is made of, the matter that underlies the form. A statue's material cause is the bronze or marble, a chair's material cause is the wood. Matter is pure potentiality. It can take on any form, it has no definite nature of its own until informed. This is why matter is at the bottom of the chain of being in Ibn Sina's system. It is the furthest from the necessary being, the closest to pure non-existence. But here is a problem that Ibn Sina never adequately resolved. Is there such a thing as prime matter, pure undifferentiated matter, with no form whatsoever? Or is all actual matter always already formed in some way? If prime matter exists, it would be pure potentiality with no actuality, which seems impossible because to exist at all is to be something definite, to have some actual properties. But if all matter is already formed, then there is no true material cause, only formal causation. The matter itself is just a previously formed composite being reshaped into a new form. This problem connects to contemporary debates about whether there are fundamental particles or whether matter is infinitely divisible. If there are fundamental particles, quarks or strings or whatever, then those are not prime matter because they have definite properties, definite forms. If matter is infinitely divisible, then there never is prime matter, only matter under some form or other all the way down. Either way, Aristotle and Ibn Sina's concept of prime matter as pure formless potentiality seems incoherent. Next is formal causation. The formal cause is the structure, the organization, the defining characteristics that make something what it is. The form of a circle is circularity. The form of a human is humanity. The form of water is H2O-ness. Form is what gives matter definiteness, what makes it this kind of thing rather than that kind. Ibn Sina makes a crucial distinction between forms that exist in matter and forms that exist separately from matter. Most forms, like the form of a tree or a horse, cannot exist except as instantiated in matter. They are inherently material forms. But some forms, specifically universal concepts and mathematical objects, exist in the active intellect independently of any material instantiation. The concept of triangle exists even if no triangular objects exist. The concept of justice exists even if no just acts exist. But this raises the famous problem of universals, one of the most contentious debates in all of philosophy. Do universals exist independently of particular instances, as Ibn Sina and Plato claim, or do they exist only in particular instances, as Aristotle and nominalists claim? Or do they exist only in minds as concepts with no external reality, as conceptualists claim? Ibn Sina tries to have it three ways. He says, forms exist in three modes: before the particulars in the divine intellect, in the particulars as their organizing principle, and after the particulars in human minds that abstract them from experience. But this seems to evade rather than answer the question, because the mode before the particulars, existence in the active intellect, is precisely what nominalists deny is possible. Consider this. If the universal form of horse exists in the active intellect before any particular horses exist, what is this form actually like? Is it a particular thing or a universal? If it is particular, then it is just another horse, not the form of horseness itself. If it is universal, then how does something universal exist as an actual being? Universals, by definition, can be instantiated in multiple particulars, but actual existence seems to require particularity. The concept of universal existence is deeply problematic. Now we come to efficient causation, and this is where Ibn Sina makes his most important contributions. The efficient cause is what brings something into existence, what initiates change, what produces effects. When a sculptor carves a statue, the sculptor is the efficient cause. When a match ignites wood, the match is the efficient cause of the fire. Ibn Sina makes a crucial distinction that would dominate philosophy for centuries, the distinction between essential and accidental efficient causes. An essential cause is one that must continue to act in order for the effect to continue existing. The cause and effect are simultaneous, and the effect depends on the cause for its very being at every moment. An accidental cause is one that initiates a process but doesn't need to continue acting. The effect can persist after the cause ceases. Here is an example to clarify this. A builder is the accidental cause of a house. Once the house is built, it continues to exist even if the builder dies. The builder initiated the existence of the house but does not sustain it. But the sun is an essential cause of the light in this room. If the sun stops shining, the light immediately ceases. The light's existence depends continuously on the sun's causal activity. Ibn Sina argues that all contingent beings have essential causes that sustain their existence moment by moment. Your existence right now depends on causes that are operating right now, not just on causes in the past that produced you. If those sustaining causes ceased, you would immediately cease to exist. This is why he thinks the regress of causes must stop at the necessary being, because only something that exists necessarily can be the terminus of a chain of essential causes. Accidental causes can regress infinitely without problem, but essential causes cannot. They must bottom out in something that is self-sustaining. But is this distinction between essential and accidental causation actually coherent? Modern physics suggests that causation is always a matter of continuous causal processes, not instantaneous dependencies. When you see an object, photons continuously travel from the object to your eye. There is no moment where the object's causation of your seeing ceases, but the seeing continues. Even the build-a-house example is misleading. The house continues to exist because molecular forces continue to hold it together, because the Earth continues to support it gravitationally, because the surrounding environment continues to sustain its structure. There may be no such thing as an accidental cause, only essential causes operating at different timescales. If that is right, then Ibn Sina's argument against infinite regress fails. Even if all causes are essential in the sense that they involve continuous causal activity, the causal chain could still regress infinitely into the past without requiring a first cause. The fact that your existence right now depends on causal processes operating right now does not mean those processes must ultimately originate in a first cause. They could be part of an infinite causal network with no beginning. Now let us examine final causation, the most controversial of Aristotle's four causes. The final cause is the purpose, the goal, the that for the sake of which something exists or acts. The final cause of an acorn is to become an oak tree. The final cause of the heart is to pump blood. The final cause of human beings is intellectual perfection. Ibn Sina fully embraces final causation and makes it central to his metaphysics. Everything acts for an end. Every process has a goal built into its nature. This is not just true of conscious agents who deliberate about purposes. It is true of everything in nature. Natural substances have built-in tendencies towards specific outcomes, and these tendencies constitute their final causes. But the rise of modern science from the 17th century onward involved the explicit rejection of final causation in nature. Galileo, Descartes, Newton and their successors insisted that we explain natural phenomena purely in terms of efficient causation, in terms of what pushes and pulls, not in terms of purposes and goals. Planets orbit the Sun not because they are aiming at circular motion as their natural goal, but because gravitational forces pull them into elliptical orbits. Water flows downhill not because it seeks its natural place, but because gravitational potential energy converts to kinetic energy. This mechanistic worldview eliminated final causation from physics and chemistry entirely, and it worked brilliantly. The success of modern science is arguably due to abandoning teleology, to refusing to explain things in terms of purposes, and instead explaining them purely in terms of mechanistic efficient causes. Ibn Sina would object that eliminating final causation makes the universe unintelligible. If things do not act for ends, if there are no purposes built into nature, then why do regular patterns exist at all? Why do acorns reliably grow into oak trees rather than randomly producing butterflies or rocks? Why does the heart develop in embryos with exactly the structure needed to pump blood? These cannot be cosmic coincidences. They reveal purpose and design built into natural substances. But modern science has an answer: natural selection. Organisms have the structures and behaviors they do not because of built-in purposes, but because random variations were selected for by their effects on survival and reproduction. Hearts pump blood effectively because organisms with poorly functioning hearts died before reproducing. Acorns produce oak trees because that developmental pathway was selected for over millions of years. Apparent purposiveness is actually the result of blind mechanistic processes sifting through random variations. Of course, natural selection only applies to living things. What about the apparent fine-tuning of physical constants? The fact that the laws of physics seem calibrated to allow for the existence of complex structures. Ibn Sina would argue this reveals cosmic purpose, that the universe is designed to produce certain outcomes. Some contemporary philosophers agree, arguing for a cosmic teleology built into the laws of nature, but the multiverse hypothesis offers a non-teleological explanation. If there are infinitely many universes with different physical constants, then by chance some will have constants that allow for complexity. And unsurprisingly, we find ourselves in one of those because we could not exist in the others. No purpose required, just anthropic selection effect. Whether you find this persuasive depends on your prior commitments. If you already believe in a purposive cosmos, the fine-tuning argument will seem powerful. If you are committed to mechanistic explanation, the multiverse hypothesis will seem more plausible. The evidence alone does not decide between them. Let us examine one final aspect of Ibn Sina's theory of causation, the unity of causal chains. Ibn Sina argues that there cannot be multiple independent causal chains operating simultaneously, because that would mean reality is fundamentally disunified, a collection of separate worlds rather than a single cosmos. All chains of causation must ultimately converge in a single source, the necessary being from which everything flows. But why should we believe this? Why could there not be multiple independent causal networks that happen to coexist spatially but are not causally related? You might say that if they occupy the same space, they must causally interact. But that assumes a particular view of space as a shared container. Maybe different causal networks occupy their own spaces that happen to overlap in some dimensions but not others, like different quantum fields interacting only weakly. Ibn Sina would respond that the very concept of being, of existence, unifies everything. If multiple independent causal chains existed, they would all share the property of existence, and that shared property requires explanation. What makes them all be rather than not be? There must be a single source of existence itself, not multiple sources, because existence is not the kind of thing that can have multiple independent origins. But this argument assumes that existence is a real property that can be caused or conferred. We have already seen the problems with this assumption in our discussion of essence and existence. If existence is not a property but simply the instantiation of an essence, then there is no mystery to explain about why multiple things exist. They just do. What Ibn Sina's analysis of causation ultimately reveals is a deep commitment to the intelligibility of reality. He assumes that everything has an explanation, that all causes form unified chains, that patterns in nature reveal purposes, that contingency must be grounded in necessity. These are not proven conclusions, but metaphysical commitments, articles of faith in reason itself. Whether they are true or useful remains an open question that each generation must answer for itself. Part 8. Prophecy, Intellect and the Active Intelligence. When Philosophy Meets Religion. Now we arrive at one of the most audacious and controversial aspects of Ibn Sina's system, his attempt to give a philosophical account of prophecy, of how prophets received divine revelation. This is where his rationalism collides most directly with religious tradition. and the collision produces sparks that illuminate both the power and the danger of his approach. Ibn Sina begins with a question that haunted medieval philosophy. How do prophets know what they claim to know? When Muhammad says he received revelation from God, when Moses claims to have spoken with the divine, when any prophet declares truths about God and the afterlife and moral law, what is actually happening? Are they hallucinating? Are they lying? Or is there a genuine cognitive faculty that allows certain rare individuals to access truths beyond ordinary reason? Ibn Sina's answer is radical. Prophecy is not supernatural. It is an extreme development of natural human capacities. Every human being has a rational soul with varying degrees of receptivity to the active intellect. Most people can grasp universal truths only slowly, through study and contemplation, after their minds are prepared through sensory experience. Philosophers can grasp truths more quickly with less preparation because their rational souls are more refined. But prophets, Ibn Sina claims, have rational souls of such extraordinary purity and strength that they can receive illumination from the active intellect instantaneously, without any preparation, without any mediation. Think about what this means. A prophet is essentially a philosophical genius multiplied by 1,000. Where a philosopher needs years of study to grasp a truth, a prophet grasps it immediately. Where a philosopher can understand universals, a prophet can also receive knowledge of particular future events, because the active intellect contains the forms of all things that will be. Where a philosopher's imagination can manipulate concepts, a prophet's imagination is so powerful that it can produce actual sensory visions and auditory revelations. The prophet genuinely sees and hears what ordinary people cannot. But here is where it gets dangerous for Ibn Sina. If prophecy is just an extreme natural capacity, then revelation is not really from God, it is from the active intellect, which is a cosmic intellect but not God himself. The necessary being, remember, does not know particulars and does not communicate with individuals. So when Muhammad receives the Quran, he is not receiving a message from God directly, he is receiving an emanation from the active intellect, which itself emanates from higher intellects, which ultimately flow from the necessary being. This makes revelation indirect, mediated, and arguably not divine at all in the traditional sense. Al-Ghazali seized on this as proof of Ibn Sina's heresy. "You have made prophets into super-philosophers," he said, "and you have made revelation into a natural psychological phenomenon." Where is the miracle? Where is the divine intervention? Where is the free choice of God to communicate with humanity? You have turned the most sacred aspect of religion into a mechanical process of emanation, no different in kind from how intellects produce celestial spheres. Ibn Sina tried to defend himself by arguing that the active intellect is divine, that it acts as an intermediary for God's knowledge. But this defense satisfied no one, because it still makes God distant and uninvolved. If God communicates only through a chain of intermediaries, then the personal relationship between God and prophet that is central to Islamic faith becomes impossible. There's a second major problem with Ibn Sina's account of prophecy. It makes prophets superior to philosophers only in speed and imagination, not in content. Both prophet and philosopher are accessing the same truths from the same source, the active intellect. The prophet gets there faster and can communicate in vivid images and stories that move the masses, but the underlying knowledge is identical. This means that philosophers, through slow, patient reasoning, can arrive at all the same truths that prophets receive through instantaneous revelation. And this has a devastating implication. If philosophy and prophecy deliver the same content, then philosophy can judge prophecy. Reason becomes the arbiter of revelation. If a prophet says something that contradicts what philosophy has established, then either the prophet was mistaken or we have misunderstood what the prophet meant. We must reinterpret revelation to conform to reason. This is exactly what Ibn Sina does throughout his works. He systematically reinterprets Quranic verses to fit his philosophical conclusions. For example, the Quran describes heaven with physical pleasures, gardens, rivers, beautiful companions. Ibn Sina says these are metaphors, symbolic representations of intellectual pleasures that the masses can understand. The true afterlife is purely spiritual, purely intellectual, as philosophy demonstrates. The Quran speaks this way only to communicate with people incapable of grasping abstract truth. But this hermeneutic strategy is profoundly problematic. Who decides when to take Scripture literally and when to reinterpret it metaphorically? Ibn Sina's answer is, the philosopher decides, based on what reason proves to be impossible or absurd. But this gives philosophy final authority over Scripture, which contradicts the fundamental Islamic commitment that the Quran is God's word and therefore cannot be corrected by human reason. You are making philosophy judge of revelation, making human intellect superior to divine speech. Ibn Sina would respond that he is not making reason superior to revelation, because true revelation and true philosophy can never conflict, since both come from the same divine source through different channels. If they appear to conflict, one of three things has happened. Either we have reasoned incorrectly, or we have misunderstood the revelation, or the revelation was not genuine. But genuine revelation and sound philosophy always harmonize. This sounds reassuring, but it creates an unfalsifiable system. Any time philosophy and Scripture conflict, Ibn Sina can claim that his philosophy is sound and therefore Scripture must be reinterpreted. There is no way for revelation to correct philosophy because philosophy has built-in immunity to revision from outside. This makes the appeal to harmony between reason and revelation vacuous. It is really just the subordination of revelation to reason disguised in ironic language. Let us examine another aspect of Ibn Sina's account of prophecy, the claim that prophets have extraordinary imaginative faculties. Ibn Sina argues that prophets can not only receive intellectual knowledge from the active intellect, but their imagination is so powerful that it can produce effects in the external world. A prophet's imagination can influence matter directly, can cause physical events to occur, and this is the explanation for miracles. When Moses parts the Red Sea, according to Ibn Sina, this is not God directly intervening to violate natural laws. Instead, Moses' extraordinarily powerful imagination, in perfect alignment with the active intellect, causes the water to move. The prophet's soul has such strength that it can impose forms on matter at a distance, similar to how your soul moves your body through willing but extended to external objects. This is a naturalistic explanation of miracles, an attempt to preserve the reality of prophetic wonders while denying that they involve supernatural intervention, but it is deeply unconvincing. First, there is zero evidence that imagination can causally affect external objects, no matter how powerful the imagination. You cannot move a cup by imagining it moving, no matter how intensely you visualize it. Why should we believe that prophets have a faculty that violates everything we know about mind-matter causation? Second, if prophets can work miracles through natural faculties, then in principle, others should be able to develop those faculties. With enough training and purification, a philosopher might achieve the imaginative power to work miracles. But this contradicts the Islamic doctrine that miracles authenticate prophets precisely because they are unique to prophets, signs that God has chosen them. If miracles are natural phenomena achievable through training, they lose their evidential value. Third, Ibn Sina's account makes miracles dependent on the prophet's psychological state rather than on God's will. If Moses parts the sea through his imaginative power, then God is not choosing to rescue the Israelites. Moses is choosing to exercise his faculty. This removes divine agency from salvation history and makes prophets the real actors, with God reduced to a distant first cause. This is theologically unacceptable to all three Abrahamic faiths. Now, let us turn to a related issue. Ibn Sina's account of practical prophecy, the prophet's role in legislation and social organization. Ibn Sina argues that societies need prophets not just to teach metaphysical truths, but to provide laws, rituals, and social structures that maintain order and guide people toward virtue. The masses cannot understand philosophical arguments about the afterlife or the nature of God, so prophets communicate through images, stories, and commandments that the masses can grasp. Religious law is not arbitrary, divine decree, it is rationally designed social engineering that guides people toward human flourishing, even if they do not understand the philosophical principles behind it. For example, ritual prayer 5 times daily serves a philosophical purpose. It habitually turns the soul toward the divine, disciplines the body, and creates social cohesion. Dietary laws protect health and train self-control. Prohibitions on usury prevent economic exploitation and maintain social stability. Every religious commandment, if properly understood, serves a rational purpose that philosophers can discern. But this approach to religious law has several problems. First, it assumes that every commandment has a discoverable rational purpose, but some laws seem arbitrary or even counterproductive. Why exactly are shellfish prohibited in Jewish and Islamic law? Ibn Sina would strain to find a health or moral reason, but the more plausible explanation is that some laws are arbitrary identity markers that distinguish the community, not rational prescriptions for flourishing. Second, if religious laws are justified by their rational purposes, then when those purposes can be achieved better by other means, the laws become obsolete. If the purpose of dietary restrictions was health protection in an era before refrigeration, then with modern food safety those laws are no longer needed. If the purpose of ritual is to habituate virtue, then other practices might achieve this better. Making law dependent on rational purposes means law is not eternally binding. It is conditional and revisable, which contradicts the notion of eternal divine commandments. Third, Ibn Sina's rationalization of religious law makes the philosopher the true interpreter of religion, superior even to religious scholars who study scripture and tradition. The philosopher, through understanding the rational purposes behind laws, knows their true meaning better than those who merely study the texts. This is supremely arrogant and politically dangerous because it gives philosophers authority to override traditional religious authorities based on their claims to superior rational insight. Let us examine the contemporary relevance of these issues. Ibn Sina's attempt to reconcile reason and revelation, to naturalize prophecy, to rationalize religious law, anticipates modern liberal theology's struggle with the same problems. How do religious people in a scientific age understand revelation? How do they maintain the authority of Scripture while accepting that it contains scientifically outdated claims? How do they preserve religious practice while acknowledging that many traditional justifications for it no longer convince? Modern liberal theologians often take an approach similar to Ibn Sina's, reinterpreting miraculous claims as metaphors, understanding revelation as human encounter with the divine filtered through cultural categories, seeing religious law as historically conditioned responses to social needs. But they face the same problem. At what point does reinterpretation become rejection? When does modernizing religion turn it into something that no longer deserves the name? Conservative religious thinkers, both medieval and modern, argue that Ibn Sina's approach destroys religion from within. By making everything subject to rational criticism, by denying genuine miracles, by treating revelation as natural psychology, by subordinating scripture to philosophy, you evacuate religion of its distinctive content. What remains is just philosophy with religious vocabulary, not actual faith in a personal God who acts in history, and there is real force to this criticism. If you follow Ibn Sina's approach consistently, you end up with a religion that most actual religious believers would not recognize as their faith. God becomes an impersonal absolute. Revelation becomes naturalistic psychology, miracles become paranormal psychology, religious law becomes social engineering, and the afterlife becomes abstract intellectual contemplation. This is not Islam or Christianity or Judaism as lived and practiced, it is philosophers' religion, intellectualized beyond recognition. But the alternative, rejecting philosophical scrutiny entirely, leads to fideism, pure faith without rational justification. And fideism has its own severe problems. It provides no way to adjudicate between competing revelations, no defense against the charge that faith is mere wishful thinking, no basis for claiming that religious beliefs are true rather than just comforting. Ibn Sina was caught in an impossible tension, a tension that remains unresolved today. Either you subject religion to philosophical critique and risk rationalizing it out of existence, or you insulate religion from critique and risk making it intellectually indefensible. Either reason judges revelation or revelation judges reason, and both options have devastating costs. Ibn Sina tried to have both, but the seams show, and the attempt to hold them together may have damaged both philosophy and religion more than it helped either. What we can learn from Ibn Sina is this: the relationship between faith and reason, between revelation and philosophy, between religious tradition and rational inquiry, is not a problem that can be solved once and for all. It is a permanent tension that must be navigated by each generation, each thinker, each believer. Ibn Sina's solution does not work, but his willingness to grapple with the tension honestly, to take both philosophy and religion seriously even when they pulled in opposite directions, remains exemplary. He showed what it looks like to think rigorously about ultimate questions without abandoning either reason or faith, even if he never achieved the synthesis he sought. Part 9. Logic and Scientific Method, How Ibn Sina Tried to Save Aristotelian Science. Ibn Sina was not just a metaphysician and theologian, he was a practicing scientist, a physician whose medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, was used in European universities for 600 years. So when he wrote about logic and scientific method, he was not engaging in abstract speculation, he was trying to articulate the principles that guided actual scientific inquiry. But his account of science, brilliant as it was for its time, reveals the fatal limitations of Aristotelian natural philosophy. Ibn Sina begins with Aristotle's conception of science as demonstrated knowledge of causes. To have scientific knowledge is not merely to know that something is the case, but to know why it must be the case, to grasp the causes that make it necessarily so. Scientific knowledge is certain, universal, and derived through rigorous logical demonstration from first principles. The structure of Aristotelian science is syllogistic. You begin with universal premises known to be true, and through valid logical inference you derive conclusions that must be true if the premises are. For example, all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, and if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. But the crucial question is, how do we know the first premises? Where do the universal truths that ground scientific demonstration come from? If they require proof, then we need prior premises to prove them, which leads to infinite regress. If they do not require proof, then they must be self-evident or known through some other means. Ibn Sina's answer involves what he calls induction, but his use of the term is very different from modern inductive reasoning. For Ibn Sina, induction is not probabilistic inference from observed instances to generalizations. Rather, it is the process by which the mind, through examining particular cases, prepares itself to receive illumination from the active intellect, at which point the universal truth is grasped with certainty. Here is how it is supposed to work. You examine many instances of fire heating things. Your sensory observations provide the particular data, but they do not by themselves yield the universal truth that all fire heats. Instead, through examining particulars, your mind becomes prepared, purified, oriented correctly. Then the active intellect illuminates your mind with the universal form of fire, and you suddenly grasp with certainty that fire necessarily heats, not as a generalization from experience, but as an insight into the essential nature of fire. But this account of scientific method is completely inadequate, and we can see this by examining Ibn Sina's own medical practice. When Ibn Sina tested treatments, tried different remedies, observed outcomes, and revised his theories, he was not preparing his mind for illumination about essences. He was engaging in empirical trial and error, hypothesis testing, probabilistic reasoning, all the methods of genuine experimental science. His theory of science does not describe what he actually did as a scientist. Moreover, the notion that examining particulars prepares you to receive certain knowledge of universals cannot explain how science corrects itself. If you grasp the essence of fire through illumination, and this gives you certain knowledge, then how could you ever discover you were wrong? But the history of science is the history of confident certainties being overturned. Aristotle was certain that heavier objects fall faster, until Galileo showed otherwise. Physicians were certain that bloodletting cured disease, until controlled studies showed it harmed patients. If scientific knowledge comes from grasping essences through illumination, these errors should be impossible. Ibn Sina has a chapter on what he calls the experimental method, and it seems promising at first. He says that to establish a causal connection between two things, you must observe them together repeatedly. You must eliminate other possible causes, and you must test whether the effect still occurs when the supposed cause is absent. This sounds like real experimental reasoning, and in his medical work, Ibn Sina sometimes followed these principles. But then he immediately undercuts this by saying that experiments can only establish that a connection exists, not that it is necessary. To know that fire necessarily heats, not just that it usually heats, requires grasping the essence of fire through intellectual intuition. Observation can suggest connections, but only rational insight into essences provides genuine scientific knowledge. This subordinates experiment to armchair metaphysics, which is precisely backwards. Let us examine a concrete example where Ibn Sina's method fails dramatically. His theory of motion. Following Aristotle, Ibn Sina believed that every motion requires a continuously acting mover. Projectile motion was explained by saying that when you throw a spear, you impart to the air behind it an impetus that keeps pushing it forward. When the impetus dissipates, the spear falls. This theory is false. As anyone who studies physics now knows, projectiles continue moving not because something pushes them, but because of inertia, because objects in motion continue in motion unless acted upon by an external force. But Ibn Sina could not discover this error through his method, because his method starts with the supposedly self-evident principle that everything in motion must have a mover. Observation is interpreted through this lens, and any observation that seems to contradict it is explained away. This reveals the fatal flaw in Aristotelian science. It privileges supposedly self-evident principles over empirical evidence. When observation conflicts with first principles, observation must be wrong or misinterpreted. But the principles themselves are never questioned because they are supposedly grasped through rational intuition of essences. This makes the system unfalsifiable, immune to correction by evidence. Modern science, by contrast, subordinates principles to evidence. No principle is so self-evident that it cannot be revised or rejected if evidence contradicts it. The principle that space is Euclidean seemed self-evident for 2,000 years, until general relativity showed that space is curved. The principle that time is absolute seemed self-evident, until special relativity showed that time is relative to reference frame. These revolutions were possible only because physicists were willing to reject principles when evidence demanded it. Ibn Sina would object that genuine first principles cannot be false, and if you think you have a counterexample, you have either misunderstood the principle or misinterpreted the observation. But this response makes first principles unfalsifiable by definition, which means they are not really claims about reality that could be true or false. They are just conceptual commitments we refuse to abandon. Let us turn to Ibn Sina's account of definitions, which reveals another fundamental problem with his scientific method. For Ibn Sina, following Aristotle, a proper scientific definition states the essence of a thing, what makes it what it is. The definition of human is rational animal. The definition of triangle is a closed plane figure with 3 straight sides, and so on. But how do we discover essences? Ibn Sina's answer is that we observe many instances of a kind, note what properties they all share, and then through intellectual intuition we grasp which properties are essential and which are accidental. The properties that make the thing what it is, that it cannot lose without ceasing to be that kind of thing, are the essential properties that belong in the definition. This sounds plausible until you try to apply it. Is having a heart essential to being human? It seems so. No human can survive without a heart. But what if medical technology advances to the point where we can replace hearts with mechanical pumps? Is someone with an artificial heart no longer human? That seems absurd, so having a biological heart is not essential after all. But then what is essential? Rationality? But people in comas or with severe brain damage are still human despite lacking rationality. DNA? But we can imagine beings with different DNA who are still persons deserving of human rights. The problem is that essence is not discovered in nature. It is stipulated by us for our purposes. We decide what counts as the same kind based on our interests and needs, not by perceiving some metaphysical essence carved into reality. This is why definitions in science are often revisable, why we argue about whether viruses are alive or whether Pluto is a planet. These are not questions about discovering hidden essences. They are questions about how we should categorize things given our purposes. Ibn Sina's essentialism led him to make confident but false claims about natural kinds. He believed that chemical substances have fixed essences that determine their properties necessarily. Gold is necessarily yellow, heavy, malleable and unreactive because these properties flow from gold's essence. But modern chemistry shows that gold's properties arise from its atomic structure, and we can change those properties by changing the structure. Gold nanoparticles are red, not yellow. Gold compounds are reactive, not inert. There is no fixed essence of gold, only a cluster of properties that typically co-occur because they result from a particular atomic configuration. Now let us examine Ibn Sina's account of classification, which is central to his scientific method. He uses a tree-like hierarchical system inherited from Aristotle, where each genus is divided into species by adding a differentia, a specific difference. Living things divide into plants and animals. Animals divide into rational and non-rational. Rational animals are humans, and so on down the hierarchy. This seems like a natural way to organize knowledge, but it has severe limitations that Ibn Sina did not recognize. First, it assumes that natural kinds form a strict hierarchy, where every individual belongs to exactly one species, every species to exactly one genus, and so on up the tree. But nature does not work this way. Many organisms are hybrids between species. Many species form continuous gradations rather than discrete categories, and horizontal transfer of genes means that the tree of life is really a tangled web, not a clean hierarchy. Second, it assumes that we can define each level by a single differentia, one property that divides the genus into species. But most real distinctions involve multiple properties that do not cleanly correlate. What single property distinguishes plants from animals? Photosynthesis. But some animals have symbiotic algae that photosynthesize, and some plants are parasitic and do not photosynthesize. Mobility, but some animals are sessile and some plants move. Cell walls, but not all plants have rigid cell walls and some fungi do. There is no single essence that cleanly divides plants from animals, just a cluster of typical features that come apart at the margins. Third, it assumes that classification reflects the true structure of reality rather than our cognitive need, but we classify things differently for different purposes. Biologists classify organisms by evolutionary relationships. Ecologists classify them by functional roles. Pharmacologists classify them by medicinal properties. Which classification is the true essence of the organism? All of them and none of them. Classification is a tool for organizing information, not a discovery of metaphysical structure. Despite these profound problems with his scientific method, Ibn Sina made genuine contributions to science, particularly in medicine. His Canon of Medicine contains careful clinical observations, systematic organization of medical knowledge, and insights that remained valuable for centuries. How did he succeed scientifically, despite having a false theory of science? The answer is that Ibn Sina was better than his theory. When actually doing science, he relied on observation, experimentation, and probabilistic reasoning, the methods that actually work. But when reflecting on what he was doing, he tried to force it into the Aristotelian framework of essences and demonstrations, which does not actually describe scientific practice. His theory of science was a rationalization after the fact, not a guide to research. This pattern is common in the history of science. Scientists often espouse theories of scientific method that bear little resemblance to what they actually do in practice. Newton claimed to deduce his laws from phenomena without hypotheses, but he actually engaged in complex theoretical reasoning involving unobservable entities. Darwin claimed to use pure Baconian induction, but he actually reasoned abductively from diverse evidence to the best explanation. What scientists say about method and what they do are often completely different. The lesson from Ibn Sina is that brilliant science can coexist with terrible philosophy of science. His medical discoveries were real despite being grounded in a false theory of how medical knowledge is possible. This should make us cautious about contemporary philosophy of science as well. Perhaps our theories of how science works are also rationalizations that will seem as quaint to future generations as Ibn Sina's essentialism seems to us. What we can salvage from Ibn Sina's account of science is his emphasis on rigor, on systematic organization of knowledge, on the search for underlying principles that explain diverse phenomena. These are genuine scientific virtues, even if his specific account of how they work is wrong. And his insistence that science aims at understanding, not just prediction and control, remains important even if we reject his claim that understanding comes from grasping essences. Modern science has abandoned Aristotelian essentialism but retained the goal of causal explanation. We want to know not just that things happen, but why they happen, what mechanisms produce the observed effects. This is Ibn Sina's project, even if we pursue it with different methods. The quest for understanding that animated his scientific work remains central to science today, even though we have learned that understanding comes from models and mechanisms, not from intuiting essences. Part 10. Where the system breaks, major failures and unsolvable problems. We have examined Ibn Sina's philosophy piece by piece, noting problems along the way. But now we must step back and confront the system as a whole, identifying where it fails most catastrophically, where it contains not just errors but structural problems that cannot be fixed without abandoning the entire framework. The first and most fundamental failure is the essence-existence distinction itself, the cornerstone on which the entire system rests. We have already seen Al-Ghazali's and Kant's objection that existence is not a property that can be added to essence. But the problem goes deeper than this. Ibn Sina needs the essence-existence distinction to be both metaphysically real and also intelligible to us. It must be real because it grounds his proof for the necessary being, his account of contingency, his entire metaphysics. But it must be intelligible because we supposedly grasp it through rational intuition. The problem is that these two requirements pull in opposite directions. If the essence-existence distinction is metaphysically real, then essence and existence must be genuinely separate components of contingent beings, like matter and form or body and soul. But then they must be related somehow. There must be some principle that joins them together into a single being. What is that principle? Ibn Sina never says, because he cannot, there is no third thing that binds essence and existence together without creating an infinite regress of further binders. But if the essence-existence distinction is merely conceptual, a way we think about things rather than a real division in things themselves, then it cannot ground a proof for God's existence. You cannot prove that reality requires a necessary being based on how we happen to conceptualize things. The distinction must cut reality at the joints, not just reflect our cognitive categories, but Ibn Sina provides no way to show that it does. Contemporary metaphysicians have largely abandoned the essence-existence distinction because of these problems. Those who talk about essence typically understand it as a set of modal properties. Properties something must have to be the kind of thing it is, not as a separate metaphysical component. And existence is not treated as a property at all, but simply as quantification over possible objects. Saying something exists is saying there is at least one instance of that kind. The second major failure is Ibn Sina's solution to the problem of evil, or rather his non-solution. We discussed this in part 2, but it is worth emphasizing again because it is not just a local problem, it reveals a deep flaw in the entire system. Ibn Sina cannot allow that God freely chooses to create this universe rather than a better one, because that would make creation contingent rather than necessary. But he also cannot allow that God is constrained by external limitations, because that would compromise divine perfection. So he is forced to claim that this universe, with all its suffering, is the best possible universe, and that every evil in it is metaphysically necessary. But this is both morally obscene and logically incoherent. It is morally obscene because it makes the torture of innocence a necessary feature of cosmic perfection. Every child dying of bone cancer, every victim of genocide, every pointless accident that destroys lives, all of these are necessary components of the best possible universe according to Ibn Sina. This is not a solution to the problem of evil, it is a celebration of evil as cosmic necessity. And it is logically incoherent because Ibn Sina has no way to establish that this universe is the best possible. He cannot survey all possible universes and demonstrate that this one maximizes goodness. He simply asserts it based on his metaphysical principles. But those principles are precisely what is in question. If the universe contains horrendous evil, that is evidence that the principles are false, not evidence that the evil is necessary. The third major failure is Ibn Sina's psychology. His account of the soul and its relationship to the body. We examined this in parts 4 and 5, but the failure is worth summarizing. Ibn Sina wants the soul to be both the form of the body, intimately united with it, and also a separate substance capable of existing independently. These requirements are contradictory. If the soul is the form of the body in the Aristotelian sense, then it is the organizational principle of a living body. It is to the body as shape is to wax. But shapes do not exist independently of matter, and forms do not survive the destruction of the things they inform. If the rational soul is really the form of the body, it cannot survive bodily death, it must perish when the body disintegrates. But if the soul is a separate substance that can exist independently, then it is not really the form of the body at all. It is an immaterial substance temporarily using a body as an instrument. This is Platonic dualism, not Aristotelian hylomorphism, despite Ibn Sina's claims to synthesize them. Modern neuroscience has made this problem even more acute. We now know that mental functions depend on specific brain structures in extraordinary detail. Damage to particular brain regions produces predictable cognitive deficits. Lesions in the hippocampus destroy memory formation. Damage to Broca's area eliminates speech production. Frontal lobe injuries change personality. If the soul is an immaterial substance independent of the brain, why do physical brain changes cause mental changes? The most natural explanation is that mental states are brain states, not states of an immaterial soul using the brain as an instrument. Ibn Sina might respond that the brain is the instrument through which the soul operates in this life, so brain damage impairs the soul's ability to function without proving that the soul depends on the brain for existence. But this analogy fails because when you damage an instrument, you do not change the user, you just limit what they can do. If I break your hammer, you are still the same person with the same skills, just unable to hammer. But brain damage changes who you are. It alters personality, memory, emotional responses, the very things that make you you. This suggests the brain is not an instrument the soul uses, but the physical basis of consciousness itself. The fourth major failure is Ibn Sina's theory of knowledge, particularly his reliance on illumination from the active intellect. We examined this in part 6, but the fundamental problem is that illumination is indistinguishable from delusion. If knowledge comes from an external source beaming concepts into your mind, you need a criterion to distinguish genuine illumination from false ideas that merely feel like illumination. Ibn Sina's only criterion is the sense of necessity that accompanies genuine knowledge. But this is notoriously unreliable. People throughout history have felt certain about beliefs that were false. The sense of certainty is a psychological state, not a guarantee of truth, and if illumination from the active intellect always produces certainty, then every firmly held conviction would have to be true, which is absurd. Moreover, the active intellect is a completely ad hoc entity introduced to solve a philosophical problem. Ibn Sina needs something to bridge the gap between the eternal immaterial forms and temporary material individuals, so he posits 10 cosmic intellects with the lowest one illuminating human minds. But there is no independent evidence for these intellects. They are invisible, undetectable, known only through their supposed effects on human cognition. This is question-begging. You cannot prove the intellects exist by appealing to the illumination they supposedly provide, while simultaneously explaining illumination by appealing to the intellects. The fifth major failure, and perhaps the most damaging for Ibn Sina's reputation, is his treatment of women. This is an aspect of his thought rarely discussed, but it reveals how even brilliant philosophical systems can be corrupted by unexamined prejudice. Ibn Sina, following Aristotle, believed that women are inherently inferior to men in rational capacity. In his biological works, he claims that female embryos result from defects in conception, that women are incompletely formed humans, cooler and moister than the ideal hot and dry male constitution. He argues that women's reproductive role makes them less suited for intellectual pursuits, that their souls achieve less perfection than men's souls, that they require male guidance and control. These views are not incidental to his system, they follow from his biological essentialism. If there are essential natures of male and female, and if male is closer to the ideal form of humanity, then male superiority follows necessarily. The same essentialism that generates his metaphysics generates his misogyny. Modern biology has completely refuted these claims. There is no difference between male and female intellectual capacity, no biological basis for male superiority, no sense in which male is the default and female the deviation. But Ibn Sina's error was not just empirical, it was philosophical. He assumed that social hierarchies reflect natural essences rather than recognizing them as contingent cultural constructions. The sixth major failure is Ibn Sina's inability to account for genuine novelty and creativity in the universe. His emanation system makes everything flow necessarily from the necessary being according to eternal patterns. There is no room for genuine innovation, for the emergence of radically new kinds of being, for free creative acts that bring into existence something unprecedented. Every event in Ibn Sina's universe is either necessarily determined by prior causes or is a mere rearrangement of pre-existing elements. The active intellect contains all forms eternally, so nothing truly new can be thought, only what was always already present in the divine mind. Material things are just combinations of matter and form, neither of which is novel, just newly configured. Where in this system is there room for genuine creation, for the emergence of the radically new? This is not just an abstract problem, it makes Ibn Sina unable to account for the evolutionary history of life, the emergence of consciousness from non-conscious matter, the appearance of new technologies and cultural forms. His system is static, cyclical, eternally repeating the same patterns, with no room for genuine historical development. The seventh and final major failure I will discuss is Ibn Sina's ethics, which is severely underdeveloped and inadequate. His entire ethical system can be summarized in a single principle: achieve intellectual perfection, and you will be happy in the afterlife. Fail to do so, and you will be miserable. Everything else in ethics, all questions of right and wrong action, justice and injustice, virtue and vice, are subordinated to this single goal of intellectual development. But this provides no guidance for most ethical questions that actually matter. Should you tell the truth when lying would save lives? Should you sacrifice yourself for others or pursue your own good? How should resources be distributed in society? What duties do we owe to strangers, to animals, to future generations? Ibn Sina's ethics has nothing to say about these questions because they do not directly concern intellectual perfection. Moreover, his ethics is profoundly self-centered. It is entirely about achieving your own eternal happiness through intellectual development, with no concern for others except instrumentally. You should be just and kind because injustice and cruelty disturb your soul and impede intellectual progress, not because others deserve justice and kindness for their own sake. This is not genuine morality, it is enlightened self-interest disguised as ethics. These failures are not minor problems that could be fixed with adjustments to Ibn Sina's system. They are structural flaws that arise from the core commitments of his philosophy, from his essentialism, his necessitarianism, his intellectualism, his substance dualism. To fix these problems would require abandoning the framework entirely and starting over with different principles. And yet, despite these failures, Ibn Sina's thought remains important, not because it is right, but because it is instructive. It shows us what happens when you try to build a complete philosophical system from a small set of rationalist principles. It reveals the tensions between metaphysical necessity and human freedom, between rationalism and empiricism, between philosophy and religion. It demonstrates both the power of systematic thinking and its dangers. We learn as much from its failures as from its successes, perhaps more. Part 11. The Firestorm, Al-Ghazali, Averroes, and the great debates that split Islamic philosophy. Ibn Sina's philosophy did not die quietly. It exploded in the most consequential intellectual controversy in Islamic history. The controversy centered on one man's devastating attack, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and the response it provoked from Ibn Sina's defender, Abu al-Walid ibn Rushd, known in Latin as Averroes. This debate was not just academic, it determined the fate of rationalist philosophy in the Islamic world for the next millennium. Al-Ghazali was born in the year 1058, about 20 years after Ibn Sina's death. He was a brilliant legal scholar, theologian, and eventually a Sufi mystic, and he wrote a book specifically targeting Ibn Sina called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. The book's goal was simple: to demolish philosophical pretensions to knowledge about ultimate reality, and to show that unaided reason cannot answer the deepest questions about God, creation, and the afterlife. Al-Ghazali identified 20 positions held by the philosophers, particularly Ibn Sina, and declared 17 of them heretical innovations and 3 of them outright unbelief. The 3 accusations of unbelief were devastating because in Islamic law, unbelief is apostasy, and apostasy is punishable by death. Al-Ghazali was not engaging in abstract debate. He was declaring that Ibn Sina's philosophy merited execution. The 3 doctrines that Al-Ghazali declared unbelief were these. First, the eternity of the world, the claim that the universe has always existed and was not created in time. Second, God's ignorance of particulars, the claim that God knows only universal principles and not individual events and persons. Third, the denial of bodily resurrection, the claim that only immaterial souls survive death and not physical bodies. Each of these directly contradicts clear Quranic teaching, and Ibn Sina held all 3. Let us examine Al-Ghazali's argument against the eternity of the world because it is philosophically sophisticated and strikes at a real weakness in Ibn Sina's system. Ibn Sina argued that the world flows eternally from God's nature by necessity. It has no temporal beginning because the necessary being is eternal and its effects must be co-eternal with it. Just as light flows from the sun necessarily and eternally, so the universe flows from God. Al-Ghazali responds, this makes creation necessary rather than voluntary. It denies that God freely chose to create. But more than that, it involves a logical contradiction. If the world flows from God necessarily, then either God is sufficient to produce the world or he is not. If God is sufficient, then the world should exist necessarily just as God does, and there should be no distinction between God and world. They should be one necessary being. But Ibn Sina wants to say the world is contingent while God is necessary, which requires explaining how a necessary being produces contingent effects, and this is impossible. If God is not sufficient to produce the world alone, then something besides God must be added to make creation possible. But then God is not truly necessary because God depends on something external. Either way, Ibn Sina's position collapses into contradiction. Ibn Sina's defenders tried various responses, arguing that the world is necessary in its cause, God, but contingent in itself. The world must exist given that God exists, but it does not exist by its own nature, only through God's nature. But Al-Ghazali crushes this distinction. If the world must exist given God's existence and God exists necessarily, then the world exists necessarily, full stop. You cannot have conditional necessity. Either something is necessary or it is contingent. There is no middle ground. Al-Ghazali's second major criticism targets Ibn Sina's claim that God does not know particulars. He argues this makes prayer absurd, worship meaningless, and moral accountability impossible. If God does not know what you do, does not hear your prayers, does not witness your actions, then religion becomes a charade. You might as well worship the laws of mathematics for all the personal relationship you can have with Ibn Sina's impersonal necessary being. Moreover, Al-Ghazali argues Ibn Sina's position is logically incoherent. If God knows himself perfectly, and God is the cause of all particulars, then knowing himself must include knowing everything that flows from him, including all particulars. You cannot perfectly know a cause without knowing its effects. A chemist who knows the nature of hydrogen and oxygen, but does not know they combine to form water, does not truly know hydrogen and oxygen. Similarly, if God knows himself as the cause of all existence but does not know what exists, then God does not truly know himself, which contradicts divine omniscience. Ibn Sina's defenders responded that God knows particulars in a universal way through knowing the universal causes that produce them. But this is the response we already saw fails. Knowing universal causes is not the same as knowing particular effects in their concrete specificity. Al-Ghazali's third accusation of unbelief concerns bodily resurrection. The Quran is absolutely explicit that bodies will be resurrected, that people will experience physical pleasures and pains in the afterlife, that the bodily form of existence continues beyond death. But Ibn Sina, as we have seen, reinterprets all of this metaphorically, claiming the afterlife is purely spiritual, and the Quranic descriptions are accommodations to the understanding of ordinary people. Al-Ghazali argues that this allegorical interpretation is not just wrong, but dishonest. When the Quran says believers will enjoy gardens with rivers and beautiful companions, it means gardens with rivers and beautiful companions, not some abstract intellectual pleasure. To reinterpret clear literal language as metaphor without any textual justification is to make yourself the arbiter of Scripture rather than submitting to what Scripture actually says. And once you start reinterpreting whatever contradicts your philosophy, Scripture loses all authority. It becomes mere raw material for philosophical speculation rather than divine revelation. Moreover, Al-Ghazali argues bodily resurrection is no less philosophically coherent than the survival of an immaterial soul. Ibn Sina says the soul can exist without the body because it is immaterial, but he also says the soul is created in time and individuated by its relationship to a particular body. If the soul's individuality depends on bodily existence, how does it remain the same individual soul after the body dies? Ibn Sina has no answer. His account of personal identity after death is incoherent. So he is in no position to reject bodily resurrection as philosophically impossible. But Al-Ghazali's most devastating criticism is not about any particular doctrine. It is about the entire philosophical enterprise of demonstrating metaphysical truths through reason alone. He argues that the so-called self-evident principles philosophers rely on are not really self-evident. They are just firmly held prejudices. Take the principle of causality, that every event must have a cause. Philosophers claim this is self-evident, that we cannot coherently deny it. But Al-Ghazali says, watch me deny it. I say that events do not have causes, they simply occur in succession by God's direct will, moment by moment. When fire touches cotton, it does not cause the cotton to burn, rather God creates burning in the cotton while fire is present. There is no causal power in fire, no necessary connection between fire and burning, only habitual correlation that God could interrupt at any moment. This is Al-Ghazali's famous occasionalism, the doctrine that God is the only true cause and apparent causes in nature are merely occasions for divine action. And the point is not whether occasionalism is true, the point is that it is coherent, conceivable, and not self-contradictory. If you can coherently deny the principle of causality, then it is not self-evident. And if the foundation of philosophical demonstration is not self-evident, then the entire edifice of rationalist metaphysics collapses. Now enters Averroes, Ibn Rushd, born in Cordoba in 1126, 99 years after Ibn Sina's death. Averroes wrote a point-by-point response to Al-Ghazali called The Incoherence of the Incoherence, defending Aristotelian philosophy against theological attack. But Averroes was not simply defending Ibn Sina. In many ways he corrected and improved upon Ibn Sina while still maintaining the rationalist program. On the eternity of the world, Averroes agrees with Al-Ghazali that Ibn Sina's position is incoherent. You cannot have the world flowing necessarily from God's nature while still being contingent. But Averroes argues that both Al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina are wrong because both assume that creation must be either necessary or voluntary, either determined or free. Averroes proposes a third option, that creation is natural to God but not necessary, like how it is natural for the sun to shine but not necessary in the sense of being compelled. But this is just wordplay, it does not solve the problem. If it is natural to God to create, then God cannot not create, which makes creation necessary, despite Averroes calling it natural. If God can refrain from creating, then creation is voluntary, and we are back to Al-Ghazali's position. Averroes has not found a middle ground. He has just obscured the dilemma with terminology. On divine knowledge of particulars, Averroes defends a modified version of Ibn Sina's position. He argues that God knows particulars but knows them in a way appropriate to divine nature, which is different from how we know them. God knows particulars universally, timelessly and immutably, whereas we know them particularly, temporally and changeably. Both forms of knowledge are genuine knowledge of the same objects, just from different perspectives. But Al-Ghazali's criticism still bites. If God's knowledge of particulars is so different from ours that it does not involve knowing them as particular, as changing, as temporally ordered, then it is not clear it is knowledge of particulars at all. It might be knowledge of abstract patterns or timeless truths, but not knowledge of you in your concrete specificity, struggling with this particular problem on this particular day. And if God does not know that, then God does not know particulars in any religiously adequate sense. On bodily resurrection, Averroes takes a position even more radical than Ibn Sina's. He argues that individual survival of any kind is impossible, bodily or spiritual. What survives death is not your individual intellect, but the universal active intellect that all humans participate in during life. When you think a true thought, it is not really you thinking, it is the active intellect thinking through you. When you die, the active intellect continues, but you as an individual cease to exist entirely. This is not just heretical, it is nihilistic. It denies any personal afterlife whatsoever. It makes death complete annihilation of the individual. The only immortality is the impersonal immortality of the universal intellect, which provides no comfort because it is not you that survives. Averroes tried to soften this by saying that people should believe in personal immortality even though philosophy proves it false, because the belief motivates virtue. But this is patronizing and dishonest. It makes philosophy a secret teaching for the elite that contradicts the public religion of the masses. The debate between Al-Ghazali and Averroes was not resolved intellectually. It was resolved politically and culturally. Al-Ghazali's critique carried the day in the Islamic world, and rationalist philosophy went into steep decline after him. The intellectual energy of Islam shifted away from philosophy toward theology, law, and mysticism. Universities that had taught philosophy stopped, libraries that had housed philosophical works let them decay, and philosophers who continued working faced persecution. Why did Al-Ghazali win? Not because his arguments were philosophically superior, many of them are not, but because he understood that philosophy as Ibn Sina practiced it was a threat to religious faith as ordinary people lived it. A religion whose God does not know you, does not hear prayers, and does not resurrect bodies is not Islam. It is barely religion at all. Al-Ghazali chose faith over reason when they conflicted, and most Muslims agreed with that choice. But the cost was enormous. The decline of philosophy in the Islamic world coincided with the decline of science, of mathematics, of creative intellectual work generally. The scientific revolution happened in Europe, not in the Islamic world, partly because Europe had incorporated and developed Ibn Sina's rationalism through Averroes, while the Islamic world had rejected it. By choosing faith over reason, Islamic civilization cut itself off from the methods that would generate modern science and technology. This is not to say philosophy would have solved all problems or that the decline had a single cause. Political instability, economic changes, and Mongol invasions all played roles. But the defeat of rationalism in the Al-Ghazali-Averroes debate removed a crucial source of intellectual vitality. When reason is subordinated to faith, when questions cannot be asked because they threaten orthodoxy, intellectual progress becomes impossible. The contemporary Islamic world still struggles with this legacy. Rationalist philosophy never recovered from Al-Ghazali's attack, and contemporary Islamic thought oscillates between uncritical traditionalism and uncritical westernization, with little space for the kind of rigorous but faithful rationalism that Ibn Sina represented. The questions Ibn Sina asked, how to reconcile reason and revelation, how to integrate faith and philosophy, how to maintain religious commitment while pursuing truth wherever it leads. These questions remain unresolved and urgent. What we learn from this debate is that the relationship between philosophy and religion cannot be resolved once and for all. Every synthesis between them is unstable. Every attempt to harmonize them papers over tensions that eventually rupture. Ibn Sina tried to make philosophy serve religion, but he ended up subordinating religion to philosophy. Al-Ghazali tried to protect religion from philosophy, but he ended up impoverishing both. Averroes tried to maintain both by keeping them separate, but he ended up satisfying neither philosophers nor believers. The debate forces us to ask, can reason and faith coexist, or must one ultimately dominate the other? And if they cannot coexist peacefully, which should we choose? These questions have no easy answers, but Ibn Sina's willingness to grapple with them honestly, even at great personal and intellectual cost, remains exemplary. Part 12. The Conquest of Europe, How Ibn Sina Shaped Western Philosophy and Science. While Ibn Sina's philosophy was declining in the Islamic world after Al-Ghazali's attack, it was just beginning its conquest of Europe. Through a remarkable series of translations and reinterpretations, Ibn Sina became one of the most influential thinkers in medieval European philosophy, shaping the thought of everyone from Thomas Aquinas to Duns Scotus to William of Ockham. This is the story of how a Persian Muslim philosopher became central to Christian scholasticism and what that tells us about the transmission of ideas across cultures. The story begins in Toledo, Spain, in the 12th century. Toledo had been reconquered from Muslim rule by Christian kingdoms, but it retained a large population of Arabic-speaking scholars, both Muslim and Jewish. European Christians, suddenly having access to the vast Arabic philosophical and scientific literature, began a massive translation project, rendering works from Arabic into Latin so European scholars could read them. Gerard of Cremona, an Italian scholar working in Toledo, translated Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine into Latin around 1187. This medical encyclopedia became the standard medical textbook in European universities for the next 500 years. It was printed 16 times in the 15th century alone, more than any other medical work. Physicians throughout Europe learned anatomy, physiology, diagnosis and treatment from Ibn Sina's synthesis of Greek, Persian and Islamic medical knowledge. But Ibn Sina's philosophical works were even more influential. His metaphysics and psychology were translated into Latin by different scholars through the 12th and 13th centuries. European philosophers encountered Ibn Sina's essence-existence distinction, his proof for the necessary being, his psychology of the soul, his theory of knowledge, and they were electrified. Here was a comprehensive philosophical system that integrated Aristotle with Neoplatonism, that provided rational demonstrations for the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, that showed how to be both rigorously philosophical and religiously orthodox, or so they thought at first. It took European Christian philosophers decades to realize that Ibn Sina's orthodoxy was more apparent than real, that his God was not the personal God of Christianity, that his rationalism had dangerous implications for faith. But by then his ideas had already reshaped European thought irreversibly. The most important European appropriation of Ibn Sina came from Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican friar who became the most influential philosopher in Catholic tradition. Aquinas read Ibn Sina carefully, adopted many of his arguments, but also modified them crucially to make them compatible with Christian doctrine. Aquinas took Ibn Sina's essence-existence distinction and made it the foundation of his own metaphysics. Like Ibn Sina, Aquinas argued that in all creatures essence and existence are really distinct, that existence is not part of what a thing is, but is added to it from outside. And like Ibn Sina, Aquinas used this distinction to prove God's existence, arguing that there must be a being whose essence is identical with its existence, a being that cannot not exist, and this being is God. But Aquinas modified the argument in a crucial way. Where Ibn Sina said the world flows necessarily from God's nature, Aquinas insisted that God freely chooses to create, that the world is contingent on divine, will not divine nature. This preserves divine freedom and avoids the problem of necessitarianism that Al-Ghazali had exposed. God is still the necessary being, but creation is a free act, not a necessary emanation. How did Aquinas reconcile these? By distinguishing between God's nature, which is necessary, and God's will, which is free but guided by God's perfect wisdom. God necessarily knows all possible universes, but freely chooses which one to actualize. The choice is not arbitrary, It is guided by divine wisdom selecting what is best, but it is still a choice, not a necessity. Whether this synthesis works is debatable, and philosophers have argued about it for 7 centuries. But it shows how Aquinas used Ibn Sina's framework while trying to correct its most problematic features. The result was a Christian Avicennism that dominated Catholic philosophy until the 20th century. Aquinas also adopted Ibn Sina's psychology but modified it significantly. He accepted the distinction between vegetative, animal and rational souls, and he agreed that the rational soul is immaterial and can survive bodily death. But Aquinas rejected Ibn Sina's illumination theory of knowledge, the idea that we learn by receiving concepts from the active intellect. Instead, Aquinas argued that we have an agent intellect within us that actively abstracts universal forms from sensory experience. This makes knowledge more our own achievement and less passive reception from outside. Aquinas also rejected the idea that there is a single active intellect shared by all humans, insisting instead that each person has their own individual intellect that continues after death. This was crucial for preserving personal immortality, which is central to Christian doctrine. If we all share one intellect, then individual survival becomes impossible, and Aquinas saw clearly that this was unacceptable. But not all European philosophers were as careful as Aquinas to correct Ibn Sina's heterodox implications. In the 13th century, a movement called Latin Averroism developed at the University of Paris, led by philosophers like Zigger of Brabant. These philosophers taught Ibn Sina's and Averroes' doctrines without Aquinas' modifications, including the eternity of the world, the unity of the intellect, and the denial of personal immortality. This created a crisis in European universities. If philosophy demonstrates that the world is eternal and the soul does not survive death, but Christianity teaches creation in time and personal immortality, then either philosophy contradicts faith, or we must say that something can be true in philosophy but false in theology. The Latin Averroists chose the latter option, teaching what they called the double truth theory, that philosophical truth and theological truth are separate and can contradict each other. The Catholic Church condemned this position in 1277, declaring that truth cannot contradict truth, that if philosophy and faith conflict, then either the philosophy is bad or the theology is misunderstood. This condemnation limited how far European philosophers could push Avicenist rationalism, but it did not eliminate Ibn Sina's influence. His concepts, his arguments, his problems became permanent fixtures of European philosophy, even when his specific conclusions were rejected. Ibn Sina's influence was not limited to metaphysics and psychology. His medical works shaped European medicine, his logic influenced medieval theories of reasoning, his physics was taught in universities, even though it was Aristotelian and would eventually be overturned. The scientific revolution, when it came in the 17th century, defined itself partly in opposition to Ibn Sina's Aristotelianism, rejecting his essentialism, his teleology, his theory of elements in favour of mechanistic explanation and mathematical physics. But the rejection was never total. Even the founders of modern science, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, were trained in Aristotelian philosophy, mediated through Ibn Sina and his European interpreters. When Descartes proved his own existence through the cogito argument, he was repeating Ibn Sina's flying man. When Newton formulated his laws of motion, he was responding to and correcting Ibn Sina's theory of motion. You cannot understand the scientific revolution without understanding the Aristotelian framework it overthrew, and that framework came to Europe largely through Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina's influence extended beyond philosophy and science into literature and culture. Dante, in the Divine Comedy, places Avicenna, Ibn Sina's Latin name, in limbo among the virtuous pagans who lived before Christ. Medieval Romance literature drew on Ibn Sina's ideas about love as an illness, about the imagination's power, about the soul's journey toward perfection. Even popular medical practices in medieval Europe, like bloodletting and humoral theory, came partly from Ibn Sina's medical encyclopedia. The irony is profound. While Ibn Sina's rationalist philosophy was being suppressed in the Islamic world as dangerous to faith, it was being embraced in Christian Europe as a support for faith. European Christians read Ibn Sina as proving through reason what they already believed through revelation: the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, the rationality of the universe. They did not see, or chose not to see, how his rationalism threatened to subordinate faith to philosophy just as it had threatened Islamic orthodoxy. This cross-cultural transmission raises fascinating questions about how ideas change meaning as they move between contexts. Ibn Sina was a Muslim philosopher working within Islamic intellectual traditions, but European Christians read him as if he were a proto-Christian, as if his arguments were designed to support Christian doctrine. They translated not just his words, but his concepts, adapting them to fit Christian metaphysics, Christian psychology, Christian ethics. The Ibn Sina who influenced Aquinas was not quite the same Ibn Sina who wrote in Arabic. He was a Latin Avicenna, reshaped by Christian interpretation. And yet something essential survived the translation: the commitment to rational demonstration, the insistence that fundamental truths about reality can be known through philosophical reasoning, the project of harmonizing faith and reason. This project defined medieval European philosophy just as it had defined Ibn Sina's work. And when European philosophy eventually moved beyond medieval syntheses, it carried forward the rationalist impulse that Ibn Sina represented. The decline of Ibn Sina's influence in Europe began in the Renaissance, when scholars gained direct access to Greek philosophical texts. They no longer needed Arabic intermediaries. They could read Aristotle and Plato in the original and discovered that Ibn Sina had modified and sometimes distorted their teachings. The essence-existence distinction, central to Ibn Sina's metaphysics, was not in Aristotle at all. It was Ibn Sina's innovation. The theory of illumination from the active intellect was a Neoplatonic addition grafted onto Aristotelian psychology. Renaissance humanists often dismissed Ibn Sina as a corrupter of Aristotle, an unfaithful transmitter who mixed Greek philosophy with foreign ideas. But this was unfair. Ibn Sina never claimed to be merely repeating Aristotle. He was critically engaging with and developing Aristotelian ideas in light of Neoplatonic and Islamic influences. His innovations were philosophical achievements, not corruptions, even when they turned out to be wrong. By the 17th century, Ibn Sina's direct influence had faded as modern philosophy developed new frameworks. But his legacy persisted in the problems he had posed and the methods he had developed. The question of how existence relates to essence, the problem of grounding contingency in necessity, the challenge of explaining consciousness and its relationship to matter, the project of proving God's existence through metaphysical argument, all these remain central to philosophy today, and all were shaped decisively by Ibn Sina. What the European reception of Ibn Sina teaches us is that great ideas transcend their original contexts. A Muslim philosopher writing in 11th century Persia could shape Christian theology in 13th century Paris, could influence Jewish philosophy in medieval Spain, could contribute to the scientific revolution in 17th century Europe. Ideas do not belong to one culture or religion, they belong to humanity, and they travel across boundaries of time and space and faith, transforming and being transformed as they go. Ibn Sina would have appreciated this. His philosophy was always universalist, claiming to discover truths accessible to reason itself, not to any particular tradition. That European Christians found value in his work, that they could use his arguments to support their own faith, would not have surprised him, because he believed that reason, properly exercised, leads all inquirers toward the same truth. Whether he was right about that remains an open question, but his influence on European thought proves at least that philosophical ideas can cross seemingly unbridgeable cultural divides and find new life in alien soil. Part 13. Why this still matters, Ibn Sina's contemporary relevance. We have journeyed through Ibn Sina's entire philosophical system, examined its brilliant insights and catastrophic failures, traced its influence and its decline. Now we must ask the most important question. Why should anyone care about an 1100-year-old Persian philosopher in the 21st century? What does Ibn Sina have to say to us, living in an age of quantum mechanics, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and existential risk? The answer may surprise you. First, Ibn Sina's core question remains unanswered. Why is there something rather than nothing? Modern physics can tell us how the universe evolved from the Big Bang, but it cannot tell us why the Big Bang happened, why the laws of physics have the form they do, why there is a universe at all rather than absolute nothingness. This is Ibn Sina's question about the scandal of existence, and we are no closer to answering it than he was. Some contemporary philosophers and physicists argue that the universe arose from quantum fluctuations in a vacuum, that nothing is unstable and naturally produces something. But this does not answer the question, it just pushes it back. Why do quantum fields exist? Why do they have the properties they do? Why are there laws that govern quantum fluctuations rather than absolute chaos? These are not scientific questions, they are metaphysical questions of exactly the kind Ibn Sina asked. Ibn Sina's answer, that contingent existence requires grounding in necessary existence, remains a live option in contemporary metaphysics. Philosophers like Robert Koons and Joshua Rasmussen defend versions of Ibn Sina's argument using modern formal logic and metaphysics. They argue that the principle of sufficient reason, that every contingent truth has an explanation, leads inevitably to a necessary foundation for reality. Critics like Graham Oppy respond that this principle is not self-evident and that infinite causal chains need no beginning. The debate continues exactly where Ibn Sina left it, which tells us something important. Some philosophical questions are not solved by scientific progress. They are permanent features of human inquiry into the ultimate nature of reality. Ibn Sina asked these questions with exceptional clarity and rigour, and his arguments remain valuable even if we ultimately reject his conclusions. Second, Ibn Sina's analysis of consciousness and the problem of relating mind to matter is more relevant than ever. Contemporary neuroscience has mapped brain functions with extraordinary precision. We know which neural circuits produce which mental states, how neurotransmitters affect mood, how brain damage produces cognitive deficits. And yet the hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved. Why does neural activity produce subjective experience? Why is there something it is like to be conscious? Ibn Sina's flying man argument anticipated this problem by 700 years before David Chalmers formulated it in modern terms. Ibn Sina recognized that consciousness has a first-person character that cannot be captured by third-person descriptions of brain states. When you experience the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the what-it-is-likeness of being you, this is not the same as a description of neural firing patterns, even a complete description. Something about consciousness seems to escape purely physical explanation. Contemporary philosophers of mind are divided between materialists who think consciousness is ultimately reducible to brain states, dualists who think consciousness is a separate substance, and various middle positions. Ibn Sina's substance dualism is out of favour, but his insight that consciousness poses a unique explanatory challenge remains widely accepted. The fact that we can imagine consciousness existing without a body, even if this is metaphysically impossible, tells us something important about the logical independence of mental and physical concepts. The rise of artificial intelligence makes Ibn Sina's questions even more urgent. If we create machines that behave intelligently, that process information, that respond appropriately to their environments, will they be conscious? Will there be something it is like to be an AI? This is Ibn Sina's question about whether form alone can produce consciousness or whether something more is required. We have no idea how to answer it, and the answer will have enormous ethical implications for how we treat artificial beings. Third, Ibn Sina's struggle to reconcile reason and revelation remains relevant in our pluralistic world. We live in societies where people hold radically different worldviews, different religions, different values, different claims about ultimate reality. How do we adjudicate between competing claims? Do we privilege scientific reason, religious revelation, cultural tradition, democratic consensus? Or do we accept that different forms of knowledge are incommensurable, that there is no neutral standpoint from which to judge them? Ibn Sina believed in the ultimate harmony of reason and revelation, that properly understood they could never conflict. But his attempt to achieve this harmony by subordinating revelation to philosophical interpretation failed, satisfying neither religious believers nor secular rationalists. We have not done better. Our contemporary debates about religion's place in public life, about teaching evolution in schools, about medical ethics and beginning-of-life issues, all replay the same tensions Ibn Sina grappled with. The question Ibn Sina could not answer, and that we still cannot answer, is whether there is a form of rationality that transcends particular traditions and worldviews, or whether reason itself is always embedded in and shaped by cultural and religious commitments. Enlightenment rationalists said yes, there is universal reason accessible to all. Postmodern critics said no, all thought is tradition-dependent and there is no view from nowhere. Ibn Sina tried to maintain both, claiming that reason is universal but that different people have different capacities to grasp rational truths. This satisfied no one then and satisfies no one now, but the problem he identified remains. Fourth, Ibn Sina's ethical vision, despite its severe limitations, speaks to contemporary concerns about meaning and purpose. In a secular age where traditional religious frameworks have lost their authority for many people, the question of what makes life meaningful has become acute. Ibn Sina's answer, that human fulfillment comes through intellectual development and the perfection of our rational capacities, is one answer that some contemporary philosophers still defend. Martha Nussbaum and others argue for a capabilities approach to human flourishing, where the good life consists in developing distinctively human capacities, including reason to their fullest extent. This is recognizably Avicennian, even if it adds dimensions Ibn Sina neglected like emotional development and social connection. The idea that human life has a natural telos, an inherent purpose that we flourish by realizing our potential, remains attractive even in a non-religious context. But Ibn Sina's intellectualism, his privileging of abstract contemplation over other forms of human excellence, seems less convincing today. We recognize many forms of human flourishing: artistic, athletic, social, practical, emotional, not just intellectual. A life devoted to helping others might be more admirable than a life devoted to philosophical contemplation, even if less intellectually developed. Ibn Sina's ethical vision is too narrow, but his insistence that human life has inherent meaning and purpose, rather than being absurd or arbitrary, remains important. Fifth, Ibn Sina's failure to adequately address the problem of evil remains instructive for contemporary theodicy. We live in a century that has witnessed horrendous evils, genocides, totalitarian terror, pointless suffering on a massive scale. Any attempt to reconcile these realities with belief in a perfect creator faces the same problems Ibn Sina faced. Either you say evil is necessary for some greater good, which seems obscene, or you limit divine power or goodness, which contradicts traditional theism. Or you accept that evil is genuine and gratuitous but maintain faith anyway, which seems irrational. Ibn Sina's necessitarianism at least had the virtue of honesty. It admitted that in a universe flowing from a perfect source by necessity, everything, including evil, must be necessary. This is morally repugnant, but logically coherent given his premises. Contemporary theodicies often try to have it both ways, maintaining divine perfection and freedom while insisting that God's choices are constrained by logical necessity or respect for human freedom. But these constraints then limit divine power, returning us to the same dilemma. Perhaps the lesson from Ibn Sina is that the problem of evil is genuinely insoluble within classical theism. Either you give up divine perfection, or divine power, or divine freedom, or the reality of evil, something has to give. Recognizing this forces us to make a choice about which commitment matters most, and different traditions make different choices. Ibn Sina chose to preserve perfection and necessity at the cost of freedom and an adequate response to evil. Others make different choices, but no choice avoids devastating costs. Sixth, Ibn Sina's scientific method, despite being superseded, reveals something important about the nature of science. Modern science is empirical, experimental, statistical and provisional in ways Aristotelian science was not. But Ibn Sina's insistence that science aims at understanding causes, not just predicting phenomena, remains important. The goal of science is not merely to generate accurate predictions, but to explain why things happen, to uncover the mechanisms and principles that govern natural phenomena. This matters for contemporary debates about the interpretation of quantum mechanics, the reality of theoretical entities, the goals of scientific inquiry. Some philosophers of science, called instrumentalists, say theories are just tools for prediction, and we should not worry about whether they describe reality truly. Others, called scientific realists, insist that good theories do describe reality, and that understanding reality is science's goal. Ibn Sina would have been a scientific realist, and his arguments for why understanding matters remain relevant. Seventh, Ibn Sina's metaphysical vision of reality as a hierarchical emanation from a single source speaks to contemporary concerns about unity and fragmentation. We live in a time of increasing specialization, where knowledge is divided into disciplines that barely communicate, where experts in one field cannot understand experts in another, where the unified worldview that once characterized educated people has shattered. Ibn Sina believed in the unity of knowledge, that physics, metaphysics, psychology, ethics, politics, and theology all formed a single integrated system grounded in the nature of being itself. This may be impossible to achieve, specialization may be unavoidable, but the aspiration towards synthesis remains valuable. Ibn Sina reminds us that fragmentation is a loss, that we should strive to see connections between different domains of inquiry, that understanding the whole matters, even if we can only grasp it imperfectly. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Ibn Sina's example matters regardless of whether his specific doctrines are true. He showed what it looks like to pursue truth with complete intellectual honesty, to follow arguments wherever they lead, even when they threaten cherished beliefs, to construct systematic understanding rather than resting in comfortable ignorance. He was willing to be called a heretic by religious authorities because he could not pretend to believe what reason showed him was false. He was willing to revise and complicate his positions when objections revealed problems. He valued truth more than orthodoxy, understanding more than comfort, rigour more than popularity. This intellectual courage is rare and valuable in any age, but especially in ours. We live in a time of increasing dogmatism on all sides, where people retreat into ideological bubbles, where uncomfortable truths are dismissed as offensive, where complex realities are reduced to simple slogans. Ibn Sina's commitment to following reason wherever it leads, his refusal to accept easy answers to hard questions, his willingness to live with tensions and uncertainties rather than pretending they do not exist, these remain exemplary. He ultimately failed to achieve his goal of a complete rational system that harmonized all knowledge and answered all questions. But the failure was noble. It revealed both the power and the limits of human reason. It showed us which problems yield to philosophical analysis and which remain intractably mysterious. We learn as much from his failures as from his successes, perhaps more. In the end, Ibn Sina matters because the questions he asked are our questions. The problems he faced are our problems. The tensions he grappled with are our tensions. He lived in a very different world, but he was recognizably one of us, a human being trying to understand reality, to find meaning, to reconcile competing claims to truth, to live with integrity in the face of ultimate mysteries. His answers may be wrong, but his questions are right, and asking the right questions is often more important than having the right answers. Read Ibn Sina not as a dead authority to be accepted or rejected, but as a living interlocutor who challenges you to think more rigorously, to question more deeply, to pursue understanding more persistently. Argue with him, disagree with him, correct his errors, but do so in the spirit he embodied, with intellectual honesty, with respect for reason, with humility before the vastness of what we do not know. That is his legacy, not a set of doctrines, but an example of how to think. And that remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago.